Well, hey there. We got a few more minutes till you guys get to experience Genesis, so we need something for you guys to do. Hey, Ralph.
Yo, the vision of this film, what are you hoping to accomplish? We're trying to show that the Bible is true, but also the science to back it up.
If we're going to have a debate about science, can you please just be honest about it?
Paulogia presents The Science of Genesis, Paradise Lost. Part 1, Before the Beginning.
Welcome to Paulogia, and my series exploring the science presented in the motion picture Genesis Paradise Lost from Creation Today. Producer Eric Hovind and director Ralph Streen spent over 5 years on the project, which intercuts 3D animated narrative segments with a number of speakers, including Ken Ham, Bodie Hodge, Georgia Purdom, and Ray Comfort. If you've seen the film, you know that while the animation can be lingering and immersive, it left not much screen time to dig deep into the science. Many topics were introduced briefly, but seconds later it was on to the next topic, almost in a gallop. With 5 years of time, care, attention, and effort poured into the project, I think we owe it to the creators to unpack Genesis Paradise Lost, giving every topic, thought, and argument its due care and attention. It can't be tackled in one video, it's going to take a series. But I think we agree the best place to start is
in the beginning.
The movie opens with a black screen, with music that is light, epic, and ominous all at once, as the camera moves slowly around a fully virtual candlelit room cluttered with beakers, books, maps, props, and a T-Rex skeleton, reminding me of the giant dinosaur that used to adorn the Batcave. We will return to this room often, as it serves as the film's narrative hub. But after the numerous company credits, we are whisked into a three-dimensional map of how the creators imagined that a pre-flood world might have been configured. I would say this opening feels inspired by the famous Game of Thrones title sequence, but I'm sure the Genesis team avoids any such unedifying television. This series isn't a review of the film, but rather an exploration of the science skimmed upon within. As such, I won't be delving much into the creative choices, artistic merit, or general entertainment value of the experience, but I'd be remiss to not acknowledge the dominating vocal performance of narrator Voddie Baucham, a theologian who previously visited the Creation Today show. His gentle yet booming voice has been praised as the highlight of this movie by many, and I'd have to agree.
Dr. Voddie Baucham is recording right now for the Genesis 3D movie,
Be fruitful,
the narration, and let me tell you, he's got a voice for narration.
Leveraging the 3D gimmick this film was fundraised on the back of, the camera swoops through lush trees, mountains, waterfalls, snow, desert, ocean, into space where the Earth is recognizable but the single continent is not, and finally coming to rest on the carcass of a dead animal and 2 pieces of simple clothing hanging out to dry on a vine, signaling to the audience that death and shame already exists in this sequence, neither of which existed in the movie's narrative until after Eve ate the forbidden fruit. The point is driven home with the picture's subtitle, Paradise Lost. The film's first interview segment doesn't make any scientific claims, but rather frames the argument that it will be making.
You see, this argument over God's existence or creation versus evolution is not so much a religious argument.
Genesis Paradise Lost is less a positive affirmation of young Earth creationism and more an anti-evolution production. This positioning was hammered home in the marketing trailers.
For over 150 years, one convincing lie has prevented billions from knowing the truth.
While questioning biological evolution is a valid tack to take, many Christians took exception, claiming the movie makes a false dichotomy, a situation in which 2 alternative points of view are presented as the only options where others are available. In this case, millions of professing Christians around the world accept both evolution and the salvation message of Jesus Christ. A prominent Christian science organization, BioLogos, said that what Genesis Paradise Lost displays is something beyond disagreement, a refusal to acknowledge that any other Christian positions even exist. And, if so many thoughtful, faithful Christians have accepted mainstream science without abandoning their faith, is it possible that Genesis Paradise Lost has drawn the battle lines of the origin debate in the wrong place? I leave that question to the viewer. The film participants then gave an appeal to the authority of the Bible.
It really becomes an issue of authority. Who is the authority? Is it God and His Word, or is it man?
That said, any argument from authority, or argumentum ad verecundium, tends to be rejected in the scientific community. In his book, The Demon-Haunted World, Carl Sagan wrote, "One of the great commandments of science is mistrust arguments from authority. Authorities must prove their contentions like everybody else." As this series will endeavor to look at the pure science of the movie in the way that a modern scientist might, we will temporarily set aside any appeals to authority and look at the evidence in isolation as best we can. In the next section, the speakers talk about the consequences of evolution being true.
Evolution has a lot of unintended consequences that I'm not sure everyone's thought about. They relate to ethics, they relate to whether or not the world's supposed to be good.
While it might be interesting to do a series about those consequences, this series is focusing on the science part. Ultimately, the consequences of something being true don't affect whether or not it is true. The score in a game can be true, even if that means a team is eliminated from the competition. The clock on the wall can correctly be reporting the time, even if that means it's time for a fun activity to be over. A disease diagnosis can be true, even if it has dire consequences to the patient. The consequences of a fact are irrelevant to the fact, so we won't address that discussion here. But at last, we're into the first section of information we can examine.
There are thousands of PhD scientists all over the world who don't accept evolution, and many of them don't accept the millions of years.
While this is a minor appeal to authority, I was curious if the number of PhD scientists who don't accept evolution could be verified. If we could verify Dr. Mortenson and the others on the things they said. Since there aren't official statistics or surveys about the opinions of the global community of scientists, it's difficult to verify if indeed there are thousands of PhD scientists who don't accept evolution. The most prominent declaration of such scientists is the Discovery Institute statement titled "A Scientific Dissent from Darwinism," which since 2001 has gathered signatures of over 700 individuals from around the world with a PhD or MD in a natural science, engineering, computer science, or medicine. There are disputes about the credentials of some of the names, but I think we can take the list at face value. 700 isn't quite thousands, but it's in the ballpark. This statement is obviously meant to be an appeal to authority, an indication that a substantial number of educated people don't accept naturalistic evolution of life, putting doubters in the audience in reasonable company. An auditorium of 700 doubters sounds substantial, but how does that stack up against the number of evolution affirmers? There aren't reliable global statistics across all disciplines, so let's compare against the most relevant group of all. 105 of the dissent signators are Americans with a PhD in biology. At the time of the initial survey, there were 153,000 active biology PhDs in the US, which means that only 0.07% of eligible biology PhDs vocally dissent to evolution. Inversely, 99.93% of biology PhDs tacitly affirm evolution. Of course, science is not determined by popular vote, but solely on its ability to make unique predictions that turn out to be correct. The speakers in the film are a mix of relatively self-taught laypeople to some with doctorate-level education. The film showed restraint in touting the credentials of any individual participant, with one strange exception, Dr. Charles Jackson.
I do have 4 degrees. Most evolutionists I've met have only 3.
I'm reminded of another recent movie.
Banner's powerful and useful too.
Is he though?
Okay, how many PhDs does Hulk have? 0. How many PhDs does the Banner have? 7.
Here, take the wheel.
No, I don't know how to fly one of these.
You're a scientist. Use one of your PhDs.
None of them are for flying alien spaceships!
While higher education of any kind deserves the utmost respect, it goes without saying that the number of degrees an individual has doesn't say anything about the fullness of their knowledge nor the correctness of their opinion. Degrees definitely do not impart expertise in all areas, as Bruce Banner attests. While Genesis Paradise Lost has a PhD geophysicist, geneticist, microbiologist, and astronomer, Charles Jackson's highest degree is not even a PhD, but rather an EDD, a degree for education, not for science. Unlike others in the movie, Charles is not a working scientist, but a school teacher.
My name is Dr. Charles Jackson, and I'm at a small Christian college in Moore, Oklahoma, teaching science here full-time. I also teach online classes for Liberty University.
I mention this only because Dr. Jackson uses the count of his mid-level education degrees to try to elevate himself above biologists who typically have a bachelor, master's, and PhD, all in the relevant field of biology. And, of course, credentials alone have no bearing on the veracity of claims made or research done. But Dr. Jackson goes on to say this.
There is a small movement in the evolutionist community to try to get the doctoral degrees rescinded from all professing creationists.
That is a bold and serious claim. When I was unable to find anything about this degree-revoking movement, I reached out to Dr. Jackson himself to help point me in the right direction. Jackson generously replied, but admitted, I really don't know where that is in print. Maybe it's not. Jackson instead pointed me to a 2007 New York Times article with quotations by evolutionists as to why creationists should never be allowed to enter science degree programs, including Dr. Michael Deeney from Texas Tech University, who Jackson quoted as saying, creationists should not be allowed to become scientists. However, in the article itself, Dr. Deeney actually said, scientists do not base their acceptance or rejection of theories on religion, and someone who does should not be able to become a scientist. He merely criticized anyone who would accept or reject ideas based on any kind of religious bias. Somewhat disturbed by Jackson's willingness to misquote someone in order to make his point, I was still anxious to learn more about this degree rescinding movement, so I asked him again to further clarify what he meant. Jackson replied, this is the most solid thing that I can remember related to that. It was just a ripple through the creationist community that some of the evolutionists were thinking that something should be done about us, and that this would be a good idea. A whispered rumor that unspecified people were perhaps thinking that some action might be a good idea is quite different from stepping into a wide-release movie and declaring unequivocally that a movement exists.
The fact that someone's trying speaks of the nature of the debate.
So was it a fact? Or was it something that Dr. Jackson heard that he exaggerated for the cameras? Despite being the least qualified scientist in the film, Jackson has the most screen time and will be making the boldest claims. Will we be able to trust his statements on big items when he isn't fully truthful in the little items? I think there's a verse about that. Of course, in a late-night interview, it might be easy to slip. The accuracy of what makes it on the big screen is ultimately the responsibility of writer Tim Gwynn, director Ralph Streen, and producer Eric Hovind. How did such a statement get past Eric's team's fact-checking process? Was there a fact-checking process at all to ensure that what his friends were saying was as accurate as possible?
Evolution is not scientific fact. The millions of years is not scientific fact. Evolution in millions of years is the greatest myth ever forced on the minds of men. The reason that everybody believes it is because they've been brainwashed.
To make a blanket statement assigning cause to literally everybody is a bit dangerous. All one would have to do to falsify such a claim would be to find a single individual who grew up and was educated believing that evolution was false, who then looked at the evidence on their own and changed their mind that evolution was true. That individual doesn't believe because of brainwashing. Such an individual might even start a YouTube channel. It might be equally easy for someone to say the only reason that anyone doubts evolution is because they've been brainwashed, and maybe point to children repeating "were you there" mantras, and Sunday schools and homeschooling, and use words like indoctrination. And it would be an equally ill-advised generalization to make. If we are to investigate clearly and honestly, let's not assume motive. Let's not assume that our current interpretations and understandings are necessarily fully correct. And let's not assume a conclusion. As we go through the science of Genesis Paradise Lost, let's assume that we all want the same thing: to know the truth that conforms closest to reality, whatever that truth may be.
Part 2. Let There Be Land.
The movie shifts from a wise warning against brainwashing into the first sequence of 3D animation, illustrating the words of narrator Voddie Baucham reading Genesis chapter 1 word for word from the King James Version of the Bible. The animators caught a bit of a break that most of day 1 was in the darkness. It is day 2 where the film had to make some creative and scientific choices.
And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament.
While I'm not entirely sure what the swirls of water represent, and there's plenty of ambiguity, Eric Hovind's animation team chose to depict the firmament described in Genesis 1 as clouds or atmosphere. The idea that the firmament could be interpreted as the clouds was first popularized in 1554 by John Calvin. Prior to this, Hebrews held that the sky was a solid dome with the sun, moon, and stars embedded within it. Revered church fathers like Clement of Alexandria, St. Augustine, and Thomas Aquinas all affirmed this solid dome plain reading interpretation. When John Calvin proposed the idea that the firmament meant the atmosphere and clouds, it was part of the divisive Copernican revolution and a controversial new doctrine of accommodation, which taught that the writers of Scripture were free to use scientific phrases and concepts consistent with the times at which they wrote, and that modern readers are free to reinterpret these phrases in light of modern understanding.
There are some people that approach the biblical text today and they view it through the lens of modern scientific interpretations.
It is interesting that Genesis Paradise Lost would be so anti-Calvin when it comes to 24-hour days and order of creation, but embrace Calvinist principles when it comes to the firmament.
Is Genesis supposed to be poetry? Is it supposed to be an allegory?
If allowed here, why can the rest of the chapter not be allowed theological accommodation?
The Bible clearly says that God created in 6 literal days, just like our days, about 6,000 years ago.
No one can say that the Hebrew word yom doesn't mean a 24-hour day.
From God's perspective, it's a day. From our perspective, Gershom, it's what? Could be 1 billion years.
So the 6 days of creation needn't be much different. They can indeed be allegory.
God created days on the 4th day. So we got 3 of these yoms, which are not of the 24-hour.
To argue that the world was created in 6 days equals 6 days is something that is asinine to even begin to discuss.
If you try to make that order of the events of the creation week match with evolutionary principles, it can't.
It does seem incompatible. Here is the biblical order of creation. Considering only the items listed, the naturalistic view holds that the stars existed first, then our sun, all before the earth. Plants are okay there. Water creatures can be first, but the whales are descended from land creatures, as are birds. That said, some read Genesis 1 from the perspective of the earth, so that the finally clear atmosphere revealed the sun, moon, and stars on day 4, even though they existed prior. Many have found various ways to reconcile this for themselves. Something you can research if you're interested.
If the days were really bazillions of years.
Bazillions? Really, Charles? Statements like this make it difficult not to treat everything you say as hyperbole. When are you being literal, and when are you being figurative?
In 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, a book that proposed a new theory on how life came to be on planet Earth.
Throughout the film, the animators inserted floating labels which give additional written commentary as an addendum to what the voiceover is saying. In this case, the text actually corrects the narration error that Darwin's Origin of the Species attempts to explain how life came to be on planet Earth. The written text correctly identifies origin of life as abiogenesis, where evolution merely attempts to explain the diversity of life. It is entirely possible that God could create the first life and nothing would have to change about Darwin's theory. However, the text misrepresents modern evolutionary theory that biodiversity has arisen from kinds magically changing into other kinds. Rightly or wrongly, evolution specifies that the entirely natural, well-observed, well-documented processes of genetic mutation and natural selection, among others, are sufficient to explain the diversity of life we see today. Scientists may well be putting too much stock in these natural processes, but natural processes are what they claim. One might look at this clip of animal creation from later in the film and describe the process being shown as magical. But certainly the film creators would insist that describing creation as magic would be a misrepresentation. It is probably a poisoning of the well word best left out of any investigation and discussion.
Darwin was strongly influenced by Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. Lyell, also influenced by others, reinterpreted geologic history through gradual processes over millions of years, a concept known as uniformitarianism.
What the film is describing here is better described as gradualism. Geologists today typically do not hold to strict gradualism. In modern usages, uniformitarianism more accurately refers to the unchanging nature of the laws of physics, that the chemistry and physics observed today are the same as those that acted in the past.
This view was contrary to catastrophism, which teaches that Noah's flood can explain much of what we find in the geologic record.
Broadly, catastrophism is the theory that changes in the Earth's crust during geological history resulted chiefly from sudden, violent, and unusual events. Before 1860, it made sense to try to explain unusual features with unusual events, like volcanoes, earthquakes, tornadoes, or flooding. But only a subset of catastrophists felt that it was a single, worldwide flood. Modern geologists hold a blended view, that Earth's history is explained by slow, gradual processes, punctuated by occasional catastrophic events, but also that the catastrophes were caused by, operated within, and can be understood entirely in the context of unchanging laws of nature. So uniformitarianism still holds across the board.
Lyell's motivation was to, quote, free the science from Moses, end quote.
This quote from Charles Lyell expressing a desire to free the science from Moses is from a letter he wrote in 1830 to George Poulet Scrope, his peer reviewer for submissions to Quarterly Review. In the letter, and others like it preserved from the time, Lyell described the length to which the members of the church were attempting to suppress his scientific findings because they conflicted with their religious beliefs. Lyell wrote, "Old Reverend John Fleming is frightened and thinks the age will not stand my anti-Mosaical conclusions, and at least that the subject will, for a time, become unpopular and awkward for the clergy. But I am not afraid." Lyell didn't set out to undermine the Old Testament, but merely took an exception when the few Christians with a specific dogmatic interpretation of the Bible blocked him from publishing his observation and findings. Since it was the Book of Moses being used against science, he naturally wanted to free the science from the Book of Moses. Given that the first segment of the movie had complaints about ideological suppression,
the secularists, the atheists, they took control of science. They took control of all the science journals, all the university science programs.
They've taken over the museums, they've taken over the state schools, they've taken over the universities.
it's strange that it would quote a letter about 19th century Christians doing the same thing. Anytime anyone uses a quotation, including a Bible verse, it's always a good idea to check the original context for meaning.
Their ideas would soon transform the culture from one that largely trusted in the biblical account of history.
It was James Ussher whose analysis of chronologies in the Bible popularized the primary assertion of this movie, that the universe is approximately 6,000 years old. So it's strange that the movie has Moses born in 1526, when Ussher has Moses born in 1571. Still others propose dates like 1391. Even more scholars, including Jewish ones, doubt that Moses was a historical figure at all. The precise dating used here is bold.
The only actual matter in the universe is the earth at the time, standing in and out of the water. Perhaps it was water that the earth was made from, and water was actually the first substance that God actually made.
Of course, if there is a creator God, he could have used any process. But from all indications, the earth is the result of coalescing and clumping of dense materials that settled into the core, lighter materials that make up the crust, and gases that acted as the early atmosphere. I could not find any creation proposal for how liquid water, or its component hydrogen and oxygen, would be natural precursors to our varied planet. Charles does not assert this idea strongly or as evidence, so we'll move on.
The third day, God then brings forth the dry land.
He raises up the land surface, so now you have the first continent. Probably only one continent. It says he gathered the waters together
to one place, which suggests that in the early Earth, there was one landmass.
It wasn't until the 1960s that geologists began to widely accept continental drift, a supposedly new idea that proposed the continents of Earth had broken up at some time in the past and slowly drifted apart.
Plate tectonics theory was nearly as earth-shaking, no pun intended, and now fundamental to geology as genetics is to biology. The continents are currently observed to be drifting at a rate of a few inches per year, though evidence shows Earth's continental history is more like the animation shown than the linear split the movie portrays. The film describes this as a slow drift, but even this so-called slow rate continues to be powerful enough to be continuously raising mountain ranges at the collisions, like currently rising Mount Everest, and rip current continents apart with massive earthquakes along San Andreas Fault in the US and the Great Rift Valley in Africa.
Just one continent split up, we believe, during the flood later on.
It was also a tectonic catastrophe, large-scale plate motion, migration of the continents by thousands of miles.
Ignoring the indirect path geologists find evidence for, and assuming the straight linear Pangea split to current positioning that the movie proposes happened in the 1 year of the flood, the Americas would have traveled at a rate of over 12 miles, 20 kilometers, per day. This is over 1 million times faster than continents move today. If you increase the speed of a marathon runner by 1 million times, they could achieve escape velocity, not only of the Earth, but even escape the gravity of the Sun. If you increase the speed of a sloth by 1 million times, that sloth is going faster than the orbit of the Earth around the Sun. If you increase the speed of a snail by 1 million times, it would move faster than the speed of the space shuttle blasting off. As the continents move, they leave a trail and path from where they rip open the ocean floor. These seafloor gaps become sealed and healed with uprising magma that cools to form new crust, almost like geological scar tissue. Precise geological dating aside, the relative age of the rock that formed to fill the ocean floor gap is gradual. If the film is correct, the full length of the scar left by thousands of miles traveled during the flood year should be approximately the same age, with the fraction of a mile of drift since the flood appearing younger. If there had been a single-year geological rocket acceleration, the trail left behind would show signs of this, but it does not.
This is a concept that the Bible already revealed thousands of years earlier. Genesis 1:9 states that God gathered together the waters unto one place, and then he made the dry land appear. What the Bible had stated all along, that the lands were once connected and then split apart, geologists started teaching thousands of years later.
Genesis 1 verse 9 says,
"Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear."
So to say that the lands were once connected is reasonable inference. However, the Bible doesn't say that the lands split apart. We know about continents now, but the authors of Genesis did not. To say that Genesis is consistent with continental drift is to apply Calvin's doctrine of accommodation, allowance of reading scriptures in light of current scientific knowledge, to the text. Again, if Eric's movie is okay with accommodation on plate tectonics and firmament as the clouds, why not other knowledge? The line seems arbitrary. Additionally, Genesis 1 verse 10 seems to contradict a single landmass.
"And the gathering together of the waters called he seas."
Already on day 3, there are multiple seas. Some apologists will interpret this as inlets into the one landmass, but in the past this was interpreted in the context of the continents always being where they are today. The point being that even Eric's movie picks and chooses which arbitrary way to harmonize natural observations and Genesis interpretation.
The flood was an incredible catastrophe, almost beyond what the human mind can comprehend.
This is a catastrophic event of unimaginable proportions.
It's almost like the surface of the earth screams at us, hey, there was a catastrophic event.
As we discussed earlier, geological catastrophes are an integral part of all geological models, but all sophisticated study reveals countless catastrophes of varying sizes, including massive volcanoes, ice ages, asteroid strikes, and yes, even floods. Distinct floods of different sizes in different locations at vastly different times. In fact, the U.S. Geological Survey compiled a list of the world's largest floods in the past 15,000 years and the evidence for them. They all left significant impacts, but none were global.
If something like that happened, what sort of evidence should that have left behind?
That's a really good question. Naturally, geologists have been studying local floods for centuries, and one consistent marker of a rapid rush of large amounts of water is diluvium deposits. These are massive ripple marks, from 2 to 20 meters tall, with wavelengths of up to 300 meters. Think the ripples in sand on a beach, but on a massive scale. First studied in the 1900s by J. Harlan Bretz and Joe Parody in Lake Missoula, these ripples are found in Asia, Europe, North America, and even on Mars, the presence of which were the first clear indicators of water there, which the movie will affirm momentarily. But these ripples are not found around the globe, which is just one thing a geologist would expect if the flood of Genesis had taken place.
Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth.
I laughed when they gave Ken Ham's catchphrase to another speaker. They gave me the unexpected in a section about expectations. Of course, the flood that Genesis described would have killed a lot of creatures, but it would have done so all at once. During a single event, the sedimentary layer that is laid down forms a single layer, with graduated sorting by density and buoyancy. But that is not what we see. We see distinct layers with distinct ecosystems. No modern creatures in the lower layers, and ancient creatures disappearing in the upper layers. No exceptions. The film even chooses to depict this in a representation of the geological column. These distinct layers are not what one would expect to see in a flood, but rather a single layer of fossils covering the entire planet.
The Bible tells us of a worldwide flood that radically changed the climate and devastated the continents thousands of years before scientists would even propose ice ages.
As Answers in Genesis will tell you, the Bible doesn't say, "and then there was an ice age," and they affirm that biblical creationists have not reached a consensus on one ice age model. When the film claims that the Bible specifically predicts an ice age, they are engaged once again in the Calvin principle of accommodation, of reading modern science into their textual interpretation. Of course, this is acceptable, but why be inclusive of some observations and not others?
The irony being that these same scientists would confirm the possibility of great global floods on planets like Mars, and yet still deny a global flood was possible on Earth.
This phrasing is almost identical to this 2007 article by Andrew Snelling, who notices that most geologists today vehemently oppose any suggestion that in the Earth's past that there were cataclysmic outbursts of water that flowed catastrophically across its surface as the global Genesis flood, even though the planet Earth is still 70% covered in water. But of course, geologists strongly affirm cataclysmic outbursts of water in the Earth's past. I pointed out the long list from the U.S. Geological Survey, which is only a fraction of the floods acknowledged in history. However, the evidence doesn't affirm a single flood at a single time. The suggestion has been heard, but not found to be supported. Snelling continues. Yet they are equally adamant that the surface of nearby planet Mars has in the past been cataclysmically covered in water, even though most of its surface is now dry. This phrase, surface covered in water, or Great Global Flood on Mars, as the film puts it, are entirely disingenuous. In the very paragraph before, Snelling acknowledges that Mars has in the past been covered by huge volumes of water, which spread over vast areas. Not spread over the whole surface, but vast areas. And by vast, scientists mean perhaps up to 1/3 of the surface at once. Never anything close to the entire surface. So Snelling's article, and subsequently the movie, misstate the scientific claims about Mars in order to appeal to common sense, and their final false assertion that the conceptual possibility of a global flood hasn't been considered, when this concept has been evaluated and weighed against evidence for hundreds of years. Finding insufficient evidence is not the same as failing to consider a possibility. A person who acknowledges that Bernie Sanders is not currently president of the United States likely still considered it to be a conceptual possibility at some point. While the narrator made an emotional appeal to common sense, the film's label for Mars included an extra claim as a visual Easter egg. Mars, approximately 6,000-year-old planet. The impact basin Hellas, Mount Albopatera, and the Tharsis Plateau evidence a young surface. While brief and vague, it appears this claim is referencing this article from Answers in Genesis, Mars, A Testament to Catastrophe from 2008. It references 3 geological features on Mars: Hellas, Mars's largest impact crater the size of half of the continental US, Mount Albopatera, Mars's largest volcano by surface area, and the Tharsis Plateau, the largest known volcano in the entire solar system. The article hypothesizes that merely because these features are relatively close together, the relationship between these gigantic features is unlikely to be a result of chance, suggesting a cause and effect relationship between them. This implies a global Martian geological catastrophe comparable in scale to the Genesis flood. The author's conjecture is that such a large asteroid hit could have set off the big volcanoes. Researchers have reasons to believe that this is not the case, but for the sake of argument, how would asteroid-caused volcanic eruptions indicate that Mars is 6,000 years old? Well, if one assumes that the Earth's impact craters came during the flood, then Mars's impact crater probably happened during the flood as well. While this may be an interesting idea or a hypothesis, this is simply not evidence. One cannot assume the age of something and then in the same breath call that assumption evidence. Assume x equals 100. Therefore, x equals 100. In a significant understatement, the article admits the model presented here is a starting point. More research is needed, not only in the areas mentioned. This kind of wishful dating method is the sort of thing the film accuses mainstream science of doing, Creationists should avoid such circular reasoning if they are to have the high ground.
You see, the Bible already stated there was a worldwide flood, and they don't want to validate the Bible. They'll come up with any other explanation but the truth.
We definitely don't want to be accepting ideas or rejecting ideas on the basis of preconceived conclusion. I hope we can all agree that evidence should come first, and then a conclusion should follow.
Part 3. Stretching the Heavens.
Having given a valid warning against starting with preconceived conclusions, the film once again alternates from talking head to Genesis 1 animation, the start of day 4 of creation.
And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven, and let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven."
You may recall from earlier in the movie, from day 2, God made the firmament.
And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament.
The film interpreted day 2 firmament as clouds, the expanse between water above and water below. But Genesis day 4 clearly places stars in the firmament. For this to be a consistent interpretation, the sun and moon and stars would have to be below the clouds. But even Eric's team acknowledges that these celestial bodies are outside of the Earth's atmosphere, far beyond the clouds. It's disappointing that the film didn't propose a resolution to these conflicting ideas.
And God made 2 great lights. The greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night.
We know now that the moon is not itself a light source. It merely reflects the light of the sun. While one can certainly interpret the passage to allow for the moon as a light reflector rather than light itself, such interpretation would not be the most plain reading. Once again, we're left to wonder which portions of the account are allowed to be interpreted and which are not.
He made the stars also.
If true, this is the ultimate understatement yada yada line in history. The story has spent the entire narrative on the tiny speck that is our galaxy, and one throwaway line on the rest of the vastness of the universe. Oh, and stars also. That is impressive.
And astronomers have started asking questions about this. They say, why does the universe appear to be designed? I read this book written many years ago called The Anthropic Principle. It's a tome of over 1,000 pages.
There have been a number of books with a similar name, but I suspect Danny means this one from 1986 by John Barrow and Frank Tipler. It's only 706 pages, not over 1,000, but it's the oldest and longest of the candidates I found.
They draw this interesting story that the world appears to be designed. When they got done, they said it just appears to be designed. There really is no design there. And I'm thinking, well, you look at the evidence and you deny that the evidence is there.
Reaching a reasonable conclusion doesn't necessarily mean that one ignored opposing evidence. In fact, a reasonable conclusion requires that all evidence be considered as a whole and weighed in the context of all the known data. For example, if my bank was robbed and my fingerprints were found at the scene, then there is some evidence that I could have committed the crime. However, if at the same time of the stick-up there is video footage of me sitting at a crowded Starbucks several blocks away, I would likely be exonerated. But that wouldn't mean that the police denied the fingerprint evidence. It just wasn't that compelling in light of all of the evidence. So the real question we should ask is, what evidence did Barrow and Tipler consider that led them to rule out a designer? In their 700 pages, they attempted to show that it is from a narrow and self-selective perspective that our pattern-seeking brains infer design where there may be none. I often refer to the example of the sentient puddle by the late Douglas Adams.
A puddle wakes up one morning and thinks, this is a very interesting world I find myself in. It fits me very neatly. In fact, it fits me so neatly, I mean, really precise, isn't it? It must have been made to have me in it.
How can you not believe that somebody designed all of this?
Just like the puddle, we need to ask ourselves if it is more reasonable that the environment around us was made specifically for us, or have we been shaped to fit our environment?
According to evolution theory or atheist evolution theory, the Big Bang created everything.
It's important to note here that the theory of evolution says absolutely nothing about the Big Bang, cosmology of any kind, or even about the origin of life. Biological evolution in no way requires a naturalistic view of the origins of the universe. It speaks only to the variety of life, and nothing at all about how the planet got here, that would be cosmology, or how life began, that would be abiogenesis. Millions of Christians affirm that God created the stars and the planets, but used evolution to diversify life. When the speakers in the film treat these as one field or one theory, they are presenting an imagined position that no one holds. Such a tactic is called a straw man argument, where a distorted version of an opponent's position is described, since a misrepresented position is often easier to dismiss than an actual position. The mighty God described in the Bible seems like he would never need to resort to tricks or distortion or dishonesty to defeat his opposition. If the Bible is truth, then it should want to go up against the mightiest strongholds to demolish them without fear.
The Big Bang created everything.
Much like the misrepresentation of evolution, the speaker now misrepresents the Big Bang theory as well. Cosmologists do not suggest that matter or energy came into existence at the time of the Big Bang. This is an important distinction as we proceed with this section of the film. The Big Bang event was merely a sudden expansion of space and already existing energy. Nothing was created, though from our perspective, this could be thought to mark the origin of our current incarnation of space and time.
And stars contracted from gas clouds out of their gravity.
That is correct.
Well, it's impossible for stars to contract out of their gravity because as soon as you get a gas cloud that compressed, it's going to heat up and hot gases want to expand.
Charles seems to be referring here to Boyle's law, which states that the absolute pressure exerted by an ideal gas is inversely proportional to the volume it occupies if the temperature remains unchanged within a closed system. As it's going to come up a few times, let's take a minute to talk about what is meant in science by open, closed, and isolated systems. In an open system, both heat and matter can enter or leave the system. Think of a pot with no lid, for example. In a closed system, heat can enter or leave the system, but matter cannot. A pot with a sealed lid would be an example. Now, an isolated system is completely sealed. Neither matter nor heat is exchanged with its surroundings. A sealed thermos would be the best example if we're staying in the world of food preparation. Many of the laws of thermodynamics relate only to such isolated systems. So it is in the case of Boyle's law, which relates only to closed or isolated systems. Decrease the volume, and you increase the pressure and the temperature. For example, squish an inflated balloon, and it will get slightly hotter. But that's the part that Charles is ignoring. This is called an ideal gas law because it applies only in certain ideal conditions that are rarely replicated in nature. In particular, the molecule cloud is not a closed system. It is an open system. Heat from star formation can and does easily escape.
And that expansion force is 100 times or more than the force of gravity.
Where we find the gas clouds Charles speaks of, though more accurately called molecular clouds, they are at an equilibrium state between pressure, determined by temperature, density, and magnetic fields, and gravity. But because of the near absolute zero temperatures, this equilibrium is very tenuous, and almost any motion event can tip the scales in gravity's favor, and the massive cloud will then fall in on itself. The cloud starts out at a relatively low density, and for a long while the heat from this increased pressure immediately radiates away without resistance. At this point, it is an open system. At some point, the condensing material goes from transparent to opaque, and at that point, the first photons become trapped and therefore increase the pressure to push back on gravity. Then and only then does trapped heat pressure build and build at a rate faster than gravity, as Charles suggests, because it has to catch up to the head start that gravity had. When the heat pressure force catches up to the force of gravity, the system reaches hydrostatic equilibrium, and it's called a protostar. Not all protostars will become stars, but it is a necessary first step. Star formation actually requires the very heat expansion force that Charles suggests is a problem.
There are all these dog ate my homework stories about how gravity waves from black holes might do a push-pull thing on gas clouds and make this actually happen. But you got a chicken and the egg problem here because don't black holes come from stars?
With gravity waves such a recent discovery, this is an odd claim and one I couldn't find in any searches. I was wondering if perhaps Charles was the one making up stories. until I found his chicken and egg problem phrasing in this 2015 article from Creation Ministries International. It isn't about gravity waves or black holes, though, but rather the role of dark matter tipping the scales for gravity in molecular clouds. Charles remembered the catchphrases, but not the science. Supernova shockwaves, in particular, were called out in the article. But this is no dog-ate-my-homework evidence-free story. It is observed. A well-known nursery for newborn stars is Nebula Hennessy 206. This infrared image shows a ring of green gas, which indicates the wake of an ancient supernova. At the fringes of that are newly formed stars. Astronomers affirm this as direct evidence that a supernova blast can trigger the collapse of a giant molecular cloud, and is but one of many examples. It is true that exploding stars cannot be the only possible catalyst for cloud collapse, or it would be a catch-22. But it is only one of a list of known catalysts that can upset the very fragile equilibrium. Two clouds can bump into each other, the cloud can pass through a galaxy spiral arm or some other moving body, or merely the accumulation of just enough additional material to tip the balance.
We have two very important concepts in physics called the first and second laws of thermodynamics. The first law says that energy is neither created nor destroyed.
That's pretty good. The first law of thermodynamics is basically a restatement of the law of conservation of energy, which states that the total energy of an isolated system remains constant. Remember the definition of isolated systems from before, one where neither matter nor energy is introduced nor escapes. From context, I assume Danny will be referring to our universe as the system, and energy remains constant within any isolated system, like the universe. But to say that this must hold outside of our universe would be merely a guess. It may or may not, and neither case would be a violation of the first law of thermodynamics.
And equally as valid as the first law is the second law of thermodynamics, which says things are currently running down, energy is becoming less useful.
The phrase running down isn't very precise, and could paint the wrong picture. The second law of thermodynamics says that within an isolated system, that's important, the total energy available for work will decrease over time.
The useful amount of energy is always decreasing, and we measure this with a thing called entropy.
Again, this is good and clear, and should be remembered. Entropy is related to the amount of energy in a system that is no longer available to do work. In the realm of physics and thermodynamics, entropy is not synonymous with things getting worse or more chaotic. Definitions are important, and Danny gives a good one. It is easy for people to misapply this physics property of entropy to unrelated concepts like biological evolution. I'm pleased that Eric's film avoids this particular mistake.
The entropy is always increasing. And it's almost like the world was wound up like a clock and it's been unwinding.
We need to be careful here how one might use the word world. If world means the Earth, well, the Earth is not a closed or isolated system at all. Energy comes in constantly from the sun, and material also enters and leaves the Earth. If he more generally means the entire universe when he says the world was wound up, then we can proceed.
The second law would seem to argue that
the universe has not always existed. The material universe has not always existed.
Indeed, it might argue that our current incarnation of the universe didn't always exist. Now, this is something already implied in Big Bang cosmology, so we wouldn't need to bring the second law of thermodynamics to bear, but that's fine.
But the first law says you couldn't have a beginning.
Well, there's the mistake. The first law says that within an isolated system, our universe, that energy cannot be created nor destroyed. The system itself is very free to have a beginning without violating the law. Outside of our universe, our isolated system, different rules may apply. But that is speculation and doesn't matter here, because there is also an important element of Big Bang cosmology that Danny is neglecting. Science tells us that the Big Bang event began with all of the energy in the universe condensed into an infinitely small point, from which it then expanded. The Big Bang does not start with nothing, it starts with all energy already existing. This is entirely consistent with the first law of thermodynamics. It's very possible that energy has always existed and will always exist. If something must be eternal, why not the eternal thing be something we all acknowledge and can prove exists, and that we equally agree cannot be created nor destroyed? If you want to argue that something other than energy is eternal, that is, by necessity, an extra assumption, and by Occam's razor would automatically be the inferior explanation.
So we have this contradiction, we have this tension. Both laws are equally true, and yet both laws have extrapolated into the past, contradict one another.
I can see why one might think that, but because these laws apply only to isolated systems, there is no contradiction. However you look at it, the start of our universe was not the start of matter and energy. It was not created in the Big Bang. Perhaps it has always existed, and this is merely the most recent form. Or perhaps the energy started from a currently unknown process outside of our iteration of space-time. The point is, none of these scenarios create a contradiction to the laws of thermodynamics.
From a secular perspective, they can only get light about halfway across the universe. That's why they have inflation theories and superinflation theories and so on, because they have a problem. They have a light time travel problem.
What Ken is saying here is true, and worth going over for a minute. If you search for this light travel problem phrase that creation astronomers like Jason Lyle use, you won't find published research. But that's because working cosmologists call this the horizon problem. In 1964, American radio astronomers Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson discovered the cosmic microwave background, CMB for short. No matter where in empty space you point a satellite, you will find a nearly identical pattern of static. If you look at this picture of the CMB and think you're seeing something from the Predator movies, you're not far off. The static hiss emission pattern is a thermal spectrum and can be used like the infrared of heat vision. 16 years earlier, in 1948, Ralph Alpher and Robert Herman made a prediction that if the universe began hot and dense, as the Big Bang model claimed, then the universe should be bathed in thermal microwaves at a temperature of about 5 degrees Kelvin. Lo and behold, that predicted evidence was found in the CMB, a nearly perfectly uniform 2.7 Kelvin. It makes sense that an isolated system like the universe would eventually reach thermal equilibrium, with hot spots and cold spots eventually evening out, like putting an ice cube in a cup of hot coffee and eventually a uniform temperature is reached. However, the way regions of space exchange energy is via photons moving at the speed of light. But with space expanding in all directions at an accelerated rate, there hasn't been enough time for the photons from one end of the galaxy to have reached the other side of the galaxy. And if this is the case, then how has such a perfect thermal equilibrium already been reached? Scientists call this the horizon problem. But the horizon problem is a problem, like a word problem on a math test is a problem. Those who pose it as a question are already aware of the solution. As Ken mentioned, inflation cosmology is a theory of exponential expansion of space in the early universe that is accepted by most physicists. It postulates a minuscule period of exponential expansion from 10 to the negative 36 seconds after the singularity until approximately 10 to the negative 32 seconds after. Since its development in 1979 by Alan Guth, new observations have confirmed inflation model predictions. It carries explanatory power not only for the uniformity of the CMB, but also a lack of magnetic monopoles, isotropic appearance of the universe, and the flat shape of the universe. Cosmic inflation isn't a mere post hoc idea. It is backed by evidence, tested, and has accurately predicted future data. The horizon problem was a question asked and now answered. But why was Ken referring to the 40-year solved horizon problem as a light time travel problem? That revised name sounds a little like the unsolved young universe starlight problem.
We used to call that the starlight problem. The nearest galaxy to us is 2 million, 1.5 million light years away. Wouldn't it take 1.5 million years for the light to get here? And yes, in straight space it would.
Straight space is a new term to me, so I went searching for any astronomy-related matches. Charles must have a special meaning for this phrase outside of scientific usage. I found these two papers on social expectations of heterosexual norms displayed within certain public locales, or straight spaces, but somehow I doubt that's what Charles was talking about.
But even the Big Bang theorists will say that space and dimension unfolded.
Couldn't find any physics literature that used the word unfolded, but they do agree that space and time, our 4 dimensions, expanded and continue to expand. As long as Charles isn't building anything on top of this folding idea, like overlapping timelines or something, we can let it pass as just strange wording.
Some people want to take mentions of in the Old Testament of God stretching out the heavens like a tent or like a canopy, stretching that light miraculously to get here.
Telescopes much larger and more advanced than these were used in the early 1900s to measure what became known as redshift, a form of measurement which provided empirical evidence that space was stretching.
The film doesn't explain redshift, so it's worth a very brief mention. It is related to the more familiar concept of the Doppler effect, where the sound waves of an object moving toward you are more compressed than the sound waves of the same object moving away from you.
It's the apparent change in the frequency of a wave caused by relative motion between the source of the wave and the observer.
With sound waves, it creates that signature noise.
I can demonstrate.
As we understand that wave amplitude affects pitch. Similarly in light, wave amplitude affects color. The compressed coming toward you waves are more blue, and expanded, or stretched, going away waves appear more red.
Now, according to Albert Einstein, if you actually stretch the fabric of space, you will also essentially necessarily have to stretch the fabric of time.
Obviously, the full concepts of Einsteinian relativity and space-time expansion is a difficult one, even for the brightest physicists. But let me take a shot at relaying the subtle flaw in what Charles is claiming here. Height, width, and depth, XYZ axes, and time are the 4 dimensions we observe. When we say that space is expanding, like this stretching fabric that the movie illustrates, we can be aware of that expansion only if we hold one dimension fixed. And that dimension is usually time. In order to see that the fabric is bigger now than it was a few seconds ago, we have to allow time to progress. It would be meaningless to stretch the time with the fabric, because then we wouldn't observe any changes. We'd always be viewing the fabric at the exact same instant as time stretches with everything else. So in order for anything to stretch, it has to stretch in relation to something fixed. If you're thinking that selecting time as the variable to be fixed is an arbitrary decision, you're right. We could fix one of the other axes and compare the movement of time to depth. But comparing time to a fixed x-axis isn't useful in a discussion about history. It can be confusing to think about because we humans experience time only linearly. But suffice to say that when Charles says that the stretch of space means a stretching of time, he is disagreeing with Albert Einstein, not agreeing with him.
So Andromeda is not just 2 million, 1.5 million light years in spatial displacement over that way, but also it's time stretched.
As we discussed, it can't be both spatially stretched and time stretched. You can describe it either way, but you can't have both at once. So unfortunately, this time stretching idea doesn't actually help the light to travel further. Where Ken intended to make cosmic inflation and starlight travel seem like they're the same, cosmic inflation addresses a spatial problem with a spatial discovery. Starlight is equally a spatial problem, which isn't solved by simply ignoring time. It would need its own spatial discovery that has not yet been proposed.
William Tift, who back about 40 years ago discovered something interesting in the redshifts of galaxies. The universe consists of concentric shells of galaxies.
In 1976, William Tift published a paper about an idea he called redshift quantization, that the values for measuring redshifts tended to cluster around multiples of specific values, which Danny and others interpret as rings of galaxies.
Astronomers more or less have ignored Tift's work over the years, and yet actually it's staring them in the face.
The editors of the Astrophysical Journal were so apathetic to the idea that they included a note on the paper stating that they could neither find errors within the analysis nor endorse the analysis. However, redshift of nearly every value in the spectrum has been observed, giving Tift's idea little predictive or explanatory power or explanatory veracity, particularly in the light of the cosmological principle, which tells us that due to the uniformity, size, and accelerated expansion of the universe, and the limitations in observation distance, that any observer from any arbitrary point in space would have every indication that they are the center of the universe. We all think that the universe revolves around us, and we're all wrong.
And we're near the center of that. If we're placed there by God for some reason, that's what you might expect.
In fact, in the time since Eric filmed these interviews, astronomers have been busy producing a massively detailed map of the universe that indicates that, in fact, the Earth is on the outskirts of a side superstructure of galaxies that has been named Laniakea. Given the Church's somewhat embarrassing backing of geocentrism, the rigid idea that the sun and all the heavenly bodies went around the Earth 4 centuries ago, I'm not sure what Danny has to gain by asserting a Milky Way-centric universe. From most people's views, the location of our galaxy has little to do with how it came to be. Probably best to leave that argument alone, Danny.
Part 4. Intergalactic Planetary.
In the middle of Creation Day 4 discussion, the movie takes an unexpected break from cosmology to talk about the nature of science itself.
You see, the other thing they've done in our education system, they said science can only explain things by natural processes.
It's not that some education board somewhere has clipped the wings of science that might otherwise make supernatural conclusions. The truth is that science itself is limited to studying the natural. I don't think Ken nor anyone in the film would suggest that science is equipped to study the supernatural. God cannot be put in a test tube. If there is something outside of nature, the scientific method cannot tell us anything about it. Scientists throughout history have acknowledged that they attempt to learn how things work, not who made them work. It may be true that God designed caterpillars to turn into butterflies, but a paper saying that God made it that way doesn't help as much as a paper describing the mechanics of the process. And describing the process naturally says nothing to deny possible supernatural origins. This is called methodological naturalism, a philosophy adopted by scientists of all faiths, or no faith, all agreeing to frame their work in terms of the natural, precisely because the supernatural simply cannot be studied by the scientific method. It would be as unhelpful as considering the color of the sunset in evaluating mathematical equations. Dr. Mary Schweitzer, among the world's most famous active Christian scientists, who is referenced later in this movie, put it this way.
When I wear my science hat, I don't have beliefs. I have only data.
They've even changed the definition of science from the study of the natural world using the five senses to be the search for natural explanation.
The philosophy of methodological naturalism goes back to Thales of Miletus, back in 600 BC, long before Jesus walked the earth. The word science itself didn't appear until 2,000 years later, in the 1400s, when it meant collective knowledge, in keeping with the meaning of its Latin root word, scientia. Like any word, usage has changed over time, but it has consistently been associated with the activity of seeking, systemizing, and sharing knowledge. The word scientist was coined in 1833 by William Wheel. For context, that's several years after Charles Darwin set sail on the HMS Beagle. Prior to that, everyone who we now call scientists would have gone by the title of naturalist, students of a branch of philosophy called natural philosophy. Notable Christians Galileo, Kepler, Bacon, Copernicus, Descartes, Pascal, and Newton, to name just a few, all went by the title of naturalist. These men are praised in Ken's Creation Museum, but they all adhered to methodological naturalism for their work. If you do a search for Danny's definition, the study of the natural world using the five senses, the only place you can find it is in a handful of books and articles written by Danny.
But who decided that? That's an arbitrary definition.
That specifically excludes any possibility of God being involved. God has not only been kicked out, but he's most unwelcome.
What I have been describing is methodological naturalism, an agreement to temporarily focus on the natural in the context of specific conversations, because only the natural can be studied with the scientific method. Ken seems to be talking about philosophical naturalism, which would be an individual's assertion that nothing beyond the natural exists. Philosophical naturalism is not a requirement for science. There are effective scientists of all faiths. Nothing in science excludes every possibility of a God, because it simply can't. Science says nothing about the supernatural.
In astronomy, as any other science, I think there are evidences that the world is far younger than many people think. Spiral galaxies would be a good example. They actually spin more rapidly at the center and more slowly out at the edges. Obviously, if this thing spins around several times, it starts smearing out the spiral arms. And as that happens, you would spin it out to the point you would end up with this amorphous disk. They think these galaxies are at least 10 billion years old. So these things would be entirely smeared out. But in 6,000 years, not much smearing taking place. In billions of years, it's a problem. Thousands of years, not a problem.
The spiral is one of the most common galaxy shapes we've observed, often with 2 arms, but we've observed galaxies with 3 and more. And if the arms of these galaxies were made up of a fixed set of stars, then by Kepler's third law, they would indeed be stretched out and wound up like some kind of cosmic taffy machine. But it turns out the arms aren't composed of a fixed set of objects, but really a pattern produced by density waves. Stars and cosmic materials are constantly coming and going from the arms, but the gravity of the effect causes these objects to slow down long enough to cause the groupings we observe. Think of it like a traffic jam. It's not always the same set of cars making up the jam. The lead cars are constantly leaving and new cars are being added at the end. But from far away, the jam appears to be a fixed mass, even though the cars that make up the jam is constantly changing. Density waves were first proposed by C.C. Lin and Frank Hsu in the 1960s, after it was observed that the arm structures themselves were moving much slower than the speed of the individual stars that made up the arms. If the stars are moving at different speeds than the arms, they simply cannot be permanent elements of the arms. Stars tend to move around the center of their galaxies in elliptical orbits, but if that center is shifting, you start to get this pattern in subsequent orbits. Keep adding the tilted orbits, and inevitably you get something that looks like 2 spiral arms, rotating density waves. The model is successful in explaining why 2-armed configurations would be most frequent, but how other numbers are possible, and predicted that this type of compression would trigger star formation. And it does. Young stars are most frequent on the leading edge of the spiral arms.
Comets really do have something to say about the age of the solar system. We can divide comets into two groups. We call the short period comets and the long period comets. For short period comets, a couple 100,000 years, they're all gone. There shouldn't be any left. Long period comets, well, tens of millions, maybe 100 million years, but they're all gone again. So for billions of years, solar system, you have a problem. Thousands of years, not a problem.
It should be clear that the age of a comet says nothing more about the age of the universe than the fresh milk in my fridge says about the age of my fridge. Danny needed to add one more sentence for this claim to be coherent. The fact that astronomers generally accept that most comets are formed during the formation of a solar system as balls of leftover ice and dust. Danny is only partially right about the ages of comets. The ranges he gives are for comets that end up entering the solar system and coming closer to the sun. You can measure how long it takes an ice cube to melt under a heat lamp, but that tells you nothing about how long that ice cube was in the freezer before being put under the lamp. But where is this deep freeze keeping comets fresh? Well, in 1950 and 1951, two separate clusters of comets were proposed by Jan Oort and Gerard Kuiper, respectively. No longer merely proposed, but highly observed since 1992, the Kuiper Belt is a region beyond Neptune about 4.5 to 7.5 billion kilometers from the Sun, containing trillions of frigid objects ranging from tiny balls to bodies over 100 kilometers in diameter. The most famous object in the Kuiper Belt is former planet Pluto, though over 1,000 have been documented in the past decade, like Eris, Ceres, Haumea, and Makemake. You may recall news stories a few years ago about Planet 9. That's also an inferred Kuiper Belt object. But most of the objects are what Danny refers to as short-period comets. When one of these ice bodies comes too close to a larger body like Neptune, its trajectory is changed, redirected toward the Sun, or hurled away into deeper space. This is the cause of the Sun-nearing comets that we are familiar with. Long-period comets come from a similar region even further out, known as the Oort cloud, starting roughly 300 billion kilometers out, 70 times further than Neptune, and extending much further out than that. Perhaps as far as a light year. Because the Oort cloud is a sphere rather than a disk, comets from this region can come from nearly any angle. The New Horizons spacecraft that documented Pluto back in 2015 will pass close by Kuiper Belt Object 2014 MU69 on January 1st of 2019, and NASA expects knowledge of the region to increase greatly as the mission progresses. I suspect Danny will want to abandon or modify the claims he made here in the coming months.
We understand the sun is powered by nuclear fusion, and that could power the sun for billions of years. As it produces energy like that, it changes its composition inside, and over time, it should slowly brighten. And as it does, the Earth would get warmer. Now, again, over thousands of years, not a problem. But if you go back a couple of billion years, 3 billion years or so, when life first supposedly developed on the planet, you have a problem because the Earth would have been far colder, and it would have been frozen, and nobody thinks that that happened. And billions of years, it's a problem. Thousands of years, not a problem.
This has been dubbed the early faint sun paradox, and Danny wrote an article about it in 2001. But the observations he based it on were first made by Carl Sagan and George Mullen back in 1972. Like all good paradoxes, there are two contradicting ideas that appear to be true at once, making the kind of present is the key to the past assumption criticized by the film earlier. Danny is doing a linear extrapolation of a single variable, temperature, and declaring this conjecture to be in conflict with the established start of life around 3.8 billion years ago. We don't actually know the conditions of initial life on Earth, and there's independent reason to think that life began in the warmth of undersea geothermal vents unaffected by the surface temperature. So Danny's paradox is actually conjecture on both ends. The more quantifiable potential paradox he could have mentioned is between ancient sun temperature and the earliest existence of liquid form water. High-precision analysis of ancient zircon indicates that the rock interacted with water 4.3 billion years ago. If the sun was indeed far colder then, this would certainly be a paradox. But in 2003, advancements in helioseismology, using sound waves to measure the interior of the sun in a similar way that they are used to measure Earth plate tectonics, allowed precise measurements indicating that our sun lost at least 4 to 7% of its mass during its youth. In 2011, astronomers published this paper with observations showing that stars analogous to our sun consistently exhibit early life mass loss due to large variability in X-ray and ultraviolet emissions. While further study remains, the suggested 20 to 25% loss of early solar mass resolves all the faint sun paradox problems. This new model explains other observations as well, including early water on Mars. Meanwhile, the 40-year-old solar model Faulkner builds his argument upon has not held up to new observations in lithium abundance or helioseismology.
In fact, other planets in our solar system testify to a young universe as well. Both the density and magnetic field of Mercury cannot allow for millions of years.
This is the first of a number of very brief scientific claims thrown out by the movie in rapid succession. But as we have more time here, it's worth looking at each one by one, even though some were difficult to research based on the few words said. This mercury density and magnetic field claim likely originates from this article by Russell Humphreys. Humphreys claimed the magnetic field on Mercury cannot be explained on a planet without a liquid core, and in his estimation, a planet as small as Mercury must have a solid core. But in 2007, physicists used ground-based radio telescopes to measure Mercury's spin rate. The highly characteristic variations point to the planet having a molten core after all. As such, new evidence has falsified Humphreys' old assumption. Speaking of Humphreys' predictions,
in 1984, Russell Humphreys correctly calculated the magnetic fields of Uranus and Neptune several years before the Voyager 2 satellite would measure them. Humphreys used a vital clue from the Bible, that the universe was made only 6,000 years ago.
The movie is referencing this 1984 paper, where Humphreys made predictions about the magnetic fields of Mercury, Mars, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto at a time before those magnetic fields had been directly measured by spacecraft. It is correct to say that Humphreys included a time since creation value of 6,000 years in his calculation, but an analysis of his work by NASA scientist Tim Thompson shows that Humphreys' characteristic decay time formula is calculated by dividing this arbitrarily selected time, t, by the magnetic dipole strength at a time of creation, mc, which is itself a function of this same arbitrarily selected t. This means that literally any amount of time chosen would yield values of the same scale, giving time effectively no influence on the results in this model. In fact, the single most impactful variable in Humphreys' model is the arbitrarily selected dipole strength, the torque caused by magnetic force on a pair of oppositely charged poles. At the time of writing, measured magnetic dipole moment values for Earth and Saturn were known by Humphreys, so he simply chose values for Neptune and Uranus larger than the Earth, but smaller than Saturn in proportion to their known sizes. He made a guess based entirely on relative mass, and those guesses turned out to be vaguely in the ballpark, though merely within an order of magnitude. In Thomson's evaluation, Humphreys' theory cannot be confirmed since it predicts at once every possible observed field, and is therefore useless in predicting anything.
And when the surface of Venus was mapped in the mid-90s, volcanoes, craters, mountains, and other features showed the history of the planet was young.
The film is referencing a decade-old soundbite like this 2006 New Scientist article. Even though the headline says, Venus's surface may be older than thought, it includes this quote that Magellan found fewer Venus surface craters than expected, suggesting that the planet's surface is actually very young. Of course, it's quite common for predictions in science to be off. While they overestimated the number of craters on Venus, they underestimated how much of the surface area would be covered, 89%, and in a random distribution of location, depth, and composition consistent with billions of years of existence. Further studies in volcanic lava flow on Venus indicate that the valley must be at least 2 billion years old. So why did these scientists say that the surface is young? Let's read the whole quote. Suggesting that the planet's surface is actually very young, perhaps 500 million to 1 billion years old. To cosmologists, 1 billion years is young. But Eric chose to allow his audience to think that they meant a few thousand years.
Neptune's too hot to be old.
Cindy Crawford is too hot to be old. You may have heard me say that before, because about a year ago, a brief clip of the film was previewed. At the time, this claim was given to a moon of Neptune, not Neptune itself.
Neptune's moon, Miranda, is too hot to be old.
With a surface temperature of minus 187 degrees Celsius, the claim that Miranda was hot was strange. Changing the claim to Neptune isn't intuitive either, with even colder temperatures of minus 200 degrees Celsius. However, I found this creation article discussing Saturn, Jupiter, Uranus, and Neptune as all 4 planets radiate more heat than they receive from the Sun. In the case of Neptune, 2.6 times the energy from the Sun. The creation paper speculates that God simply made Neptune very hot initially, and it simply hasn't cooled all the way down yet. But this model doesn't hold up well to Neptune temperature observations, which have held steady for decades and have actually increased in the past 15 years, not cooled down. The graphic on screen of the movie says that only a young planet can generate heat. But there are chemical processes, atmospheric conditions, radiation, fusion, thermal properties of the core, and more that can fully account for net heat from a planetary body. That science does not yet have enough data to be conclusive as to which of these are at play in Neptune's particular case shouldn't be mistaken for impossibility. Future exploration will undoubtedly reveal more, helping to confirm one of these ideas, or perhaps proposing entirely new ones.
Pluto still has nitrogen in its atmosphere.
Earth and other planets have nitrogen, so I wasn't sure what was problematic about Pluto nitrogen until I found Danny's article where he asserts that because Pluto is small, it possibly should have been depleted long ago. But that doesn't sound very precise. It turns out the rate of nitrogen escape from Pluto has been studied. Assuming the current rate of 500 tons per hour, multiplied by 4.5 billion years, that's a mere 0.15% of Pluto's total mass. A fraction of a percent in all that time doesn't seem problematic.
The rings of Saturn and Neptune aren't uniform, as they would be after millions of years.
While I couldn't find any predictive modeling to show us what billion-year planetary rings should look like, it has long been established that planetary rings don't form at the same time as the planet itself. Rather, they are made out of debris drawn in later by the body's gravity. This could be literally any amount of time after planetary formation. The rings and the planet are not the same age. That said, in 2007, NASA released findings indicate that the debris in Saturn's rings are a wide variety of ages. The rings accumulated not in a single event, but we now observe that the material is constantly recycling, shattering and reforming in the frictionless vacuum of space, defying any atmosphere-centric sorting expectations.
So do we trust in the timeline of men who are repeatedly wrong and having to change their beliefs?
Why would it be a bad thing to adjust what you believe when flaws are detected, new evidence is found, or new insights are gleaned?
Or do we trust in the Bible, which has never been proven wrong?
Never been proven wrong is a poor standard. That leprechauns exist has never been proven wrong. That holding a banana in your ear prevents alien abduction has never been proven wrong. That souls are reincarnated has never been proven wrong. I would think that for important matters, the standard should be proven right.
And does not change.
One need look no further than Mark 16 or John 8 to know that the contents of the Bible have changed over time. And, of course, the interpretation of the Bible can change drastically from era to era, and even person to person. Would you want to go to a doctor who is deliberately unaware of new treatments? Would you want to go to a mechanic who refuses to check your vehicle's computer? Something that never changes is rarely a good thing.
Part 5. Life from non-life.
Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life.
If we're talking about moving creatures, this matches with empirical evidence. The first vertebrates were water-based ancestors of fish, though older than that were single-celled organisms, bacteria and archaea, the first multicellular eukaryotes, and later sponges and jellies.
And fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven.
The earliest fossils of birds appear well after the first land creatures, but the film will take a look at that later. In the meantime, it's confusing that Eric chose to represent the day 2 firmament as atmosphere, then on day 4 the firmament was outer space. Now the firmament is back to being the sky where birds fly.
And God created great whales.
As you know, whales are mammals. Again, the empirical evidence shows that whales and dolphins are the descendants of land mammals. For a theistic evolutionist, the ordering of whales and birds here is a challenge to explain.
And every winged fowl after his kind.
The film uses the King James Version of the Bible, which uses the phrase winged fowl. Fowl specifically refers to the birds in the Gallo-Ansary clade, like chickens, turkeys, and ducks. Other English translations of Genesis use winged birds. But Eric's film goes even further, interpreting fowl to include winged reptiles like tyrannosaurs.
And the evening and the morning were the 5th day.
As you'd expect, the movie's Day 5 discussion begins with the origin of life. In science, the origin of life is called abiogenesis, and has prompted a field of science called prebiotic chemistry. Unfortunately, the presenters either deliberately or incidentally mistake the process of abiogenesis, a question about chemical interactions, as a part of evolution, which is merely the study of the diversification of life after it existed. To say that abiogenesis is a part of evolution is no different than saying that farming is a part of baking, or mining for copper is a part of iPhone manufacturing, or that pig butchering is a part of NFL football.
Louis Pasteur proved spontaneous generation wasn't true.
Prior to 1862, it was commonly held that some kind of vital principle in the air could create complex life where there was none before. Maggots appearing in dead flesh or fleas appearing in dust lent credence to the idea of spontaneous generation. This may seem silly now, but it was an understandable idea at the time. Louis Pasteur designed the swan neck flask experiment, which exposed boiled broth to the air, but his custom apparatus prevented dust and bacteria from reaching the liquid. When nothing grew in the broth, Pasteur effectively killed the idea of spontaneous generation.
But all evolutionists, every evolutionist believes in spontaneous generation of life.
Absolute words like all, every, and never should be used with caution, as they can undermine the idea you're trying to present and can be overturned with a single counterexample. As we've discussed, there are millions of Christians around the world who accept evolution, and many of those contend that the first life was an intervention by God. A belief in a naturalistic origin of life isn't required to accept evolution.
This whole evolutionary concept that life came from non-life, it actually violates a law of science. It is one of the only laws in biology. It's called the law of biogenesis.
The very notion of laws in biology is hotly contested in the field, where principles that are occasionally informally labeled as laws are really more like patterns or generalizations. This phenomenon was studied in 2010 by Pawan Dahar and Alessandro Giuliani, affirming that the unique characteristics of biology make it less conducive to absolute principles than the harder sciences like chemistry and physics. Even the most solid biological observation, Mendelian inheritance, has known exceptions, so the scientific notion of a law, observations for which no exceptions have been found, just doesn't really apply here. As such, a search for the phrase law of biogenesis will return results almost exclusively from creationist sources that have a motivation to overstate and exaggerate the case. For biologists, the notion of laws is rarely applied. The instant mouse notion of spontaneous generation is so far in our past that it just isn't referenced in scientific literature any more than meteorologists write about lightning from Thor's hammer.
It says that life comes from life, not non-life.
That was meant to debunk the notion that an unattended bag of rice would create mice where there was no mice before. It refutes exactly the kind of instantaneous appearance illustrated in 3D in the previous scene. So it's an odd choice to talk about here. The idea of spontaneous generation is in direct contrast with the idea of abiogenesis, which refers to the eventual natural formation of the basic chemicals that form organic compounds necessary for life.
The law of biogenesis that says all life comes from pre-existing life, and yet evolution says that life can come from non-life. Surprise, if you just wait long enough.
As mentioned before, evolution doesn't say anything at all about the origin of life, so it's too bad he keeps repeating this misunderstanding. And what Charles is saying is akin to insisting that because a baby will never spontaneously appear in a bed, that there can be no bed-related activity that could eventually lead to the appearance of a baby. One is not actually related to the other.
Every evolutionary story starts with the Miller-Urey experiment.
And there's a good reason discussion begins with the Miller-Urey experiment, as it was the first major success in prebiotic chemistry. In 1952, Harold Urey and Stanley Miller set out to test the chemical origin of life based on the conditions thought at the time to be those present in the early Earth. They mixed methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water in a network of flasks connected to a continuous 60,000 volts electrical current. After a week, most of the ammonia and most of the methane had been replaced by carbon monoxide, nitrogen, and amino acids, the building blocks of proteins and essential components of life, emerging from natural processes without intervention. And Georgia was right. This experiment was only the beginning, as the experiment has been repeated many times over in the past 60 years. Joan Oro in 1961, Miller's repeat in 1983, Jeffrey Bada in 1996, just to name a few, each with variations in the initial chemical makeup to reflect different ideas about Earth's early atmosphere, yet each producing similar results time and time again.
Anytime they've done these type of origin of life experiments where they're trying to take a soup, so to speak, of all these different molecules, add a little bit of lightning,
cook everything together, add a spark, and out comes amino acids. That's impressive. Ooh.
Okay, we'll try it again without the sarcasm.
Andrew is trying very hard to use his voice to imply that the audience should be disappointed with these results. In order for DNA and RNA to do their job of making proteins, they need access to the main ingredient for protein, amino acids. If the experiments didn't produce amino acids, they would be absolutely no help in explaining a natural emergence of life.
it's not even meaningful information as far as DNA is concerned.
Complete modern DNA is likely one of the final steps in the process of the first cell. Starting with the necessary components, like amino acids, is obviously the first step. Would you expect a chef to make an omelet without eggs? Would you expect a blacksmith to make a sword without metal? No manufacturing process can start without first having the raw materials. Georgia seems to think that we should have a printing press before paper and ink.
The best yields they've ever gotten was 80% L amino acids and 20% D amino acids. That would mean that every fifth amino acid in a protein series would be lethal to all forms of life on our planet. The evolutionists tried to get away from this problem of chirality.
When Charles talks about L amino acids, D amino acids, and chirality, he's referring to the handedness of a molecule. The term chirality comes from chir, the Greek word for hand. Due to the nature of the structure of their components, some molecules can form in two different ways, each the mirror image of the other. One configuration is dubbed left-handed, or L, Latin laevus for left, and the other configuration right-handed, or D, Latin dexter for right. It is true that most amino acids found in proteins occur in the L configuration. However, the mere existence of D configuration molecules is not deadly or dangerous, as you might infer from Charles' statement. For example, sugars in DNA use D configuration, and life continues to go on. Unfortunately, in order for a complex chemical structure like DNA to be stable, it must be purely homochiral, all the same handedness. In organic chemistry, a mixture of 50% L and 50% D is called racemate. In the manufacture of drugs or other compounds, these need to be separated. And fortunately, the different configurations react differently when exposed to other chiral phenomenon. Typically, the organic chemist will use a ready-made homochiral substance from a living organism. But there would be no living organisms in existence to utilize before the origin of life. There are other known mechanisms that can potentially induce homochirality: circularly polarized ultraviolet light, beta decay, quartz powders, clay minerals, magnetic fields, and
The best they've been able to do is the idea that the amino acids assembled themselves on the backs of floating crystals in the ocean.
What's with the little sing-song mockery when Charles says floating crystals?
Do I detect a note of sarcasm?
Are you kidding me? This baby is off the charts. Why? Oh, a sarcasm detector. Oh, that's a really useful invention.
The movie just showed a 3D sequence of a flock of birds materializing mid-flight like they were beamed there from the Enterprise. So I think it would be a little more productive to discuss ideas and scientific merit than engage in belittling voice games. Here's the paper Charles is referring to. Of course, it doesn't actually refer to any of the crystals as floating, though it's unclear as to why that would make them less plausible. As shown in the study, crystallization is yet another natural process that can potentially induce homochirality. Far from Charles' flippant characterization of floating on the backs of crystals, researchers simply ran a Miller-Urey-inspired process, but then crystallized the resulting materials. It is well established that minerals act as catalysts in chemical reactions to form complex molecules from simple ones. See this example from Kawamura and Morel from 2017, which is a fascinating read on the chemical evolution of RNA molecules from inorganic material through mineral-mediated RNA. For the record, the amino acids and self-crystallization experiment was highly successful in forming a variety of amino acids in a high ratio of single chirality. The researchers characterized it as having valuable implications for future studies.
Their schemes and the things they've tried to imagine just don't work.
Even if, one day, scientists are able to go from raw chemicals all the way to cellular life in a single lab experiment, that wouldn't necessarily reflect the way life actually arose on Earth. It would merely demonstrate that such a process is possible. That's all any of these experiments are meant to show: plausible methods by which chemicals can progress naturally toward life. Science has demonstrated that the first step is plausible, repeatedly demonstrable, and possibly even inevitable. All the remaining steps are quite plausible, even if some of the hurdles may take some time and effort to jump. Not yet knowing the specifics is the start of all scientific inquiry.
If you take the cell and you poke a hole in it, you have all the components for the cell and yet no life.
If you put a cake in a blender, you'd have all the components of cake and yet no cake. If you put a smartphone under a hydraulic press, you'd have all the components of a smartphone but no smartphone. Lots of things can be irreparably damaged, but that has nothing to do with whether another can be produced.
They'll say, well, that's an origin of life issue, and I'm not going to deal with that. But you have to deal with it, because there's no point in dealing with any of these other things if you cannot even get an organism in the first place.
Finally, Georgia understands the separation of abiogenesis and evolution, but her conclusion doesn't make any sense. Is there no point in studying for your driver's test if you don't know everything about how the motor works? Is there no point to watching The Dark Knight, since we don't know for sure the Joker's origin story? Is there no point in getting to know someone if we don't already know their parents? Is everyone studying cancer treatment wasting their time until we can pinpoint what causes cancer? Of course not. We can and should absolutely study the diversity of life, even though we don't yet know everything about the origin of life.
Part 6. Enter the Dinosaur.
Alan Fiducia, the head of biology at UNC Chapel Hill, says that it will be the paleontological embarrassment of the 20th century, the idea that birds evolved from dinosaurs.
In what seems to be a pattern, Charles plays a little fast and loose with his quotation here. Here's the article from Science, November 1996, where Fiducia is quoted by the author. Charles got part of it right. Will be the greatest embarrassment of paleontology in the 20th century. But was Fiducia referring to birds evolving from dinosaurs like Charles claims? The entire quote reads, "In my opinion, the theropod origin of birds will be the greatest embarrassment of paleontology in the 20th century." As a reminder, the theropods are hollow-boned, three-toed dinosaurs like the Velociraptor, Allosaurus, and Tyrannosaurus. Why did Fiducia specify theropod here? Because while Alan Fiducia famously goes against the scientific consensus that birds are descended from theropods, his contention is that instead, theropods and birds evolved from an as yet unidentified common ancestor, which itself would be a dinosaur.
They're not a related lineage at all.
That is simply incorrect. Alan Fiducia, the man Charles quotes here, fully accepts and defends that birds are related to dinosaurs. He just has a minor disagreement as to what kind of dinosaurs that birds are related to. Charles has either misunderstood or misrepresented the research he's quoting. Neither option is a good option.
Consider dragons. We see dragon legends in cultures all over the world.
Consider mermaids. We see mermaid legends in cultures all over the world. Mesopotamia, ancient Greece, British Islands, Europe, China, Africa, Thailand, to name a few.
We find petroglyphs, like cave drawings and etchings.
We find ancient carvings of mermaids, and coins, writings, paintings.
And many of these are images of dragons and creatures that we would call dinosaurs today.
And many of these are images of mermaids and creatures that we would call, well, mermaids today. Because half fish, half humans have never actually existed. Yet by Bodie's logic, if there are ancient legends that have superficial similarities across cultures, then we should automatically simply believe that these legends are true. If this is the case, then Bodie should believe in the phoenix, centaurs, sphinx, griffins, and fairies, to name a few. But we don't typically believe in those creatures, or even assume that there's necessarily a kernel of truth to these legends. It's easy to see that these creatures are merely extensions and wild extrapolations from common beasts. Dragons are obvious extrapolations of any reptile. Why would we make a special exception for dragons to assume they were based in fact when the other creatures in the stories were not? And suppose dragons were based on dinosaurs. Is it not equally plausible that ancient people found fossilized dinosaur bones and used those as their inspiration for dragons? Some cases of this are documented in this book by Adrian Mayer. Why would the inspiration for these legends have to have been live dinosaurs?
the word dinosaur didn't exist until 1841. So before 1841, very often the word dragon would have been used.
Okay, but there are no instances in scientific literature, or naturalistic literature as it would have been called at the time, prior to 1841, of a naturalist using the word dragon to describe any natural phenomenon. It's not like it was ever used in that context.
Now when it comes to evidence of dinosaurs and man living at the same time, believe it or not, we actually have an immense amount.
Immense amount sounds like a lot of evidence. Rather than conceding that the viewer should just believe it or not, as Bodie puts it, I assume the movie will take a few minutes to talk about some examples. It sounds a little far-fetched, but here we go.
When we actually look at ancient histories from various cultures,
we get very detailed descriptions. Those are creatures that today, in our modern world, we would call dinosaurs.
Descriptions of dragons in fantastical genre tales can be kind of applied to creatures we currently know as dinosaurs. Was that the immense amount of evidence? The Samarangana Sutradhara, written in India around 1000 BC, contains a lengthy passage describing a flying machine that we would definitely call an airplane today. Should we therefore conclude that India had airplanes in 1000 BC?
In the past, dinosaurs were simply known as dragons, even as late as the early 1900s. Dictionaries described dragons as now rare and a huge serpent.
Notice how now rare was italicized there. When a dictionary definition includes the phrase now rare, it means that a particular usage or spelling of the word has become rare, but is included in the dictionary for historical context. It doesn't mean that the word itself, nor the subject of the word, is rare. You can see this for yourself with some antiquated definitions of husband-like, dote, rectitude, and even information. The phrasing used in Eric's movie implies that the dictionary is saying that dragons are rare. And by extension, dragons were previously plentiful, when all the dictionary is really saying is that people using the word dragon to describe large serpents doesn't really happen very often anymore.
The Bible speaks descriptively of creatures that sound like dinosaurs. In the book of Job, God tells Job to behold the behemoth, a creature Job would have known. In fact, God specifically says that he made the behemoth along with mankind, and describes it as having a tail that sways like a cedar tree.
This is straying from the kind of science claims I like to examine, but as it is being held up here as prophetic evidence, I'll share a few thoughts from my own examination of this passage in Job. First, it's worth noting that most scholars of the Old Testament who have looked at the entire passage in Hebrew identify the animal being described here as a hippopotamus, elephant, rhinoceros, or buffalo. The Hebrew root word for behemoth is closely associated with cow or cattle. The only part of the description in dispute seems to be around this sentence about the tail. Second, while the narrator says sways like a cedar tree from the NIV version, on screen it shows the King James version, which says he moveth his tail like a cedar. Either way, we're talking about motion and not size. The tail moves like a cedar. It doesn't say that it's the size of a cedar. And how does a cedar move? Some basic swaying in the wind, maybe? Even the animation played in the movie doesn't seem very cedar-like in movement. Third, and least appropriate for Sunday school perhaps, is that the word in this verse that King James translates as stones is entirely, definitely a euphemism for testicles. And scholars note that the word moveth here is better translated as extends. Some English translations even translate it as stiffen, since stiffening his tail is part of the very same sentence as a description of his testicles. It's at least plausible to suggest that Job is telling us that the erection of Behemoth is like a cedar tree. Fourth, and possibly most obvious, is that the most clearly defining feature of a sauropod is its neck. Would you really write a passage about a brachiosaur and fail to mention its neck? Would you describe a giraffe without a word about its neck? It seems unlikely.
My daughter came back from her kindergarten class when she was younger. She brought home a book that said that dinosaurs lived 100 million years ago.
I'm confused about why we're getting a story about Charles' daughter's experience in kindergarten, merely to establish a common scientific claim. Is this to evoke an emotion of some kind? Also, scientific consensus is very firm that the last major dinosaur extinction event was 65 million years ago. Charles uses 100 million. While it is certainly correct that there were dinosaurs alive 100 million years ago, it can be suspicious when the teller of a story includes arbitrary round numbers. It makes it sound like Charles might be misremembering details again.
That is just an assertion. They're just saying it.
An assertion is a confident and forceful statement that the speaker wishes the listener to take purely on authority. Kind of like earlier in this segment where Bodie asserted that there's lots of evidence for humans living with dinosaurs. That may well be, but it wasn't presented.
They didn't observe this. You can't repeat this.
Of course, if it happened to be true that anything at all was happening 100 million years ago, no human would have been present to observe it. Is the lack of a human observer a good reason to dismiss an idea? If we were to go into a forest and find a tree fallen over, but could find no one who watched it fall over, are we unjustified in imagining that it fell? Or must we conclude that it grew horizontally on the ground because that's all human has seen?
It is man, fallible, imperfect men who separate man from dinosaurs by somewhere in the neighborhood of about 65 million years now.
Did scientists really just make up that 65 million year number, pulling it out of a hat? Or did these imperfect humans have any reasons at all for any of their claims? That will have to wait for the next segment.
Part 7, Obituary Column.
One of the things that really helps to convince people of the millions of years is that chart of the geological column.
For anyone wanting to research more about this subject, it's worth noting that what Terry calls the geological column is more commonly known in geology literature as the stratigraphic column. While synonymous, searching geological column tends to return creation-themed literature, where a stratigraphic column tends to bring up geological science literature. Be sure to read both for a complete picture.
Where you see the rock layers, and then you've got the timeline on the side with the millions of years, and then you've got the bottom-dwelling sea creatures and then fish.
I can see why Terry wants to make a distinction between bottom-dwelling sea creatures and fish. Fish are vertebrates, meaning they have a backbone, and there are no vertebrates until the Cambrian layers, so no fish in the Precambrian layers. These Precambrian layers are not merely a thin strip either. They actually account for more than 80% of the layers on Earth, from 4 billion years ago to about 540 million years ago. In terms of life, what we do find in these bottom layers are single-celled organisms, protoalgae, tube-like filamentous organisms, and stromatolite microorganisms. This is a far cry from the kind of bottom-dwelling sea creatures we observe today. Coral, squid, sharks, demersal fish, anglerfish, and all the crazy things marine biologists keep finding in the mostly unexplored depths.
Fish and amphibians and reptiles and dinosaurs and birds and mammals and people. How did that geological column get developed? It was back in the late 18th and early 19th century.
This is correct. The first practical application of stratigraphy, and precursor of the column, is considered to be William Smith's 1815 geological cross-section map of England and Wales. However, the principles of stratigraphy began at least 300 years earlier, including the work of Nicholas Steno, who came up with the law of superposition, which states that in undisturbed strata, the youngest layer is on top and the oldest layer is on the bottom. There are two primary subdisciplines in stratigraphy. Lithostratigraphy investigates the physical rock material aspect of the strata, like Steno studied in the 1600s and Johann Lehmann in the 1700s, putting forth the idea that groups of rocks tend to be associated with each other in a historical sense. The other is biostratigraphy, which compares the fossils within strata, starting at least 100 years later with Smith's work.
They started to use the fossils, certain fossils called index fossils, to date a rock layer.
An index fossil is any animal or plant preserved in the rock record of the Earth that is characteristic of a particular span of geologic time or environment. To be useful in the field, the fossil must be from a species that is distinctive or easily recognizable, abundant, have a wide geographic distribution, and have existed for a relatively short range of time. Some examples include ammonites, echinoid, graptolite, and trilobite. Index fossils are used as a guide to correlate strata around the globe. Since the type and amount of sediment laid down varies by region, common index fossils can infer that strata in different parts of the world, even those featuring different kinds of rock, should be considered of a correlating time frame. Index fossils can also be used by paleontologists in the field to make quick approximations without involving lab work. Since all known Narinia trondosa are from the Jurassic era, it's a reasonable working assumption that a layer of rock in the field with a Narinia trondosa fossil is Jurassic. That said, Terry's claim that index fossils are used to date a rock layer is an overstatement. In any academic endeavor, the age of the rock is ultimately determined by one or more forms of radiometric dating done when back in the lab. It is ultimately the age of the rock that is used to give an age to the fossil, not the other way around.
Oh, well, that rock layer is this old because we know that the rock layers that have those fossils are this old. Well, you might ask, how'd they know how old the fossils were? Good question. They didn't. They were making assumptions about the history of life. That assumption is just invalid.
The age of fossils are determined by doing some form of radiometric dating on the rock the fossil is found in. The cast of the film does have concerns about the assumptions of radiometric dating, which we'll talk about in the next segment. But agree or disagree, there is an actual method used. It's not merely conjecture.
Remember this? The geologic column. You were probably taught in school that each layer represents a different period of time and was deposited over millions of years. In reality, each layer is simply showing the order of how things were buried.
Fossils are actually not the evidence of the history of life, it's the evidence of the death of all life during Noah's flood and how those things got buried.
You would be hard-pressed to find anyone who denies that the geological column represents the order of death of these plants and animals. This minor distinction is to introduce the idea that perhaps the flood merely overtook some groups of animals before other groups. This has some intuitive appeal, as it seems large dinosaurs might have had a more difficult time scrambling to higher ground than nimble mammals and birds. So it might make sense to see birds at the top, then mammals, then reptiles, etc. But it's difficult to imagine that the ability to escape sorted the creatures as perfectly as it did. For example, you'd have to accept that every single flightless, waddling penguin found high ground before every single, much more agile velociraptor, and that every single mammoth outscrambled every single flying pteranodon. Eric's Creation Today ministry has previously advocated for a form of hydrologic sorting, where perhaps the churning of the water somehow sorted the fossils by density, with the least buoyant creatures settling first to the bottom. But looking at clams alone, we see that the oldest are tiny, and they get much bigger in higher layers. Not what hydrologic sorting would predict. Far more creatures are out of order than in order for this method to be valid. The hydrologic sorting phenomenon with rocks also creates a single gradiated layer, not the kind of obvious layer distinctions we observe.
Sea creatures are found from the lowest to the highest layers.
There are sea creatures all the way through the rock record.
As evolutionary theory generally holds that life began in the oceans, and that we continue to observe abundant ocean life today, a biologist would find it rather unremarkable that ocean creatures would be found in each layer. Indeed, it would have been far more remarkable evidence for the flood story if the movie could have said that there were land creatures all the way through the rock record. But they couldn't, as this is simply not the case. There are no land creatures at all in the lowest layers. In fact, it's only in the top 20% that we start to find fossils of land dwellers. Obviously, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, so while a lack of such fossils doesn't preclude the possibility, the truth of the matter is that not a single squirrel, or cow, or sloth or armadillo in any way got stuck or trapped in the lower 80% of the flood. No land creature was injured or sleeping or living in a cave when the flood hit. Not a single land animal died before the flood to have their corpse found in the lower layers. In fact, in his famous debate with Ken Ham, Bill Nye indicated that to find a single rabbit in the Precambrian layer would be enough to falsify evolution to his satisfaction. As yet, no such Precambrian bunny has been found.
And we find sea creatures on the tops of all of our highest mountains. There are sea creatures on the tops of the Himalayas, the Alps, the Andes, the Rockies. How'd they get up there?
Terry's correct that sea creature fossils can be found on the tops of mountain ranges, and this can seem curious at first, though the answer is surprisingly simple. First, we must consider how the mountain ranges form in the first place. Generally, they occur when the plates of the Earth's crust collide and create volcanic buildup and create some sort of uplift of the material of one plate rising over the other. This is not a controversial view. Even the preeminent young Earth creation ministry, Answers in Genesis, whose founder and staff appear in the film, affirms that the ranges listed by Terry, the Rockies, Alps, and Himalayas, would have been flat regions before the flood and were raised up during and after the flood as a result of tectonic plate collisions. Where a mainline geologist will say that this uplift process takes millions of years, a creationist group like Answers in Genesis will say it happened quickly, like a car crash. But both groups agree that the mountain ranges with marine life fossils were raised up from a once low position. So then, everyone agrees that the rocks that are now on tops of the mountains were once at sea level or lower. As such, the fossils found there needn't have traveled to the tops of the mountain on their own, but were instead raised up with the rest of the rock. marine life tracks and evidence of plant growth and ecosystem interactions on these mountains help affirm that the fossils were deposited before the uplift. This is the view of mainline geologists and paleontologists and their creation counterparts alike, even though for some reason the film allows the viewer to infer that perhaps the waters of the flood carried the sea creatures up there.
In fact, 75% of the Earth's land surface is made up of sedimentary layers, which are rock layers that are formed in water.
Sedimentary layers can be formed in water, but the sediment can also form from wind, melting of glacial ice, sliding in response to gravity, and precipitation under low temperature and pressure at the surface. So not necessarily water. Sedimentary rock does comprise 75% of the land surface and over 90% of the ocean basins. However, by volume, the sedimentary rock shell is only 5% of the terrestrial crust and less than 1% of the Earth's total volume. The bulk is igneous and metamorphic rock.
Geologists also confess that the world is riddled with massively eroded features, like the Grand Canyon in America, the Blythe River Canyon in South Africa, and the Capertee Valley in Australia.
Even colloquially, the word erosion refers to the gradual destruction of something. There is a time element. The Grand Canyon, the Blythe River Canyon, and Capertee Valley are indeed all the results of many years of erosion, of small amounts of water slowly carving in roads. While it is true that soft materials can give way to large volumes of water, the kind of meandering twists and turns found in the Grand Canyon are observed only in processes taking millions of years, particularly with the type of stone involved.
And yet, they still refuse to acknowledge a worldwide flood.
The film doesn't specify, but it seems to imply a point of view that such erosion must have happened while Noah's flood covered the earth. But again, even Answers in Genesis concede that the geological features we see would not be explained by the years of submersion. Instead, Answers in Genesis hypothesizes post-flood scenarios involving water basins and rapid erosion. Even if rapid erosion adequately explained these geological features, bursting water basins have been known to happen from non-flood causes. Is it really a refusal to acknowledge the flood? Or does flood geology fail to explain everything we observe? If it interests you, I'd encourage you to investigate this topic further. But the film is moving on without giving details, so shall we.
Part 8. Dating Troubles.
Well, a lot of people think the biblical chronology couldn't be true because the Bible says the earth is 6,000 years old.
You may recall from Part 2 that the 6,000-year age belief doesn't come directly from any passage of Scripture, but rather from James Ussher and others who endeavored to add up all the given ages in all the chronologies in the Bible. In other words, this 6,000-year age comes from a particular interpretation of the Bible, not something the book says explicitly. Even if the Bible is a divinely inspired work, I think everyone would agree that human interpretations are subject to human error.
That's very, very different than saying the Earth is 4.5 billion years old.
That is very different.
How do we know it's 4.5 billion years? Because it's only ever stated. It's 4.5 billion years. We know that. Well, how do you know that? Radioactive dating.
What was that voice for? I thought the point of this movie was to present scientific evidence for six-day creation. And now you've got a PhD in microbiology making an argument from funny voices? Let's hear that again.
How do we know it's 4.5 billion years? Because it's only ever stated. It's 4.5 billion years. We know that. Well, how do you know that? Radioactive dating.
And now let's hear the same thing, but from another perspective.
How do we know it's 6,000 years old? It's only ever stated. 6,000 years, we know that. Well, how do we know that? Biblical genealogies.
Was that helpful? Did it add anything to the discussion? But we've already seen this poisoning the well with inflection from Charles, and now we're getting it from Andrew. Is this film legitimately trying to make an argument, or merely providing affirmation to those who already believed before the film started? Note that Drew's 6,000-year version is much more accurate. Even if you believe it, it's the 6,000-year estimate for the Earth that is literally only ever stated. The only place you can find that claim is in the pages of the Bible. Taking all of creation science at face value, you might arrive at a less than 10,000-year estimate, but specifically 6,000 is quite literally only ever stated. As for the 4.3 billion year age of the Earth, accept the conclusion or not, but recognize that scientists from multiple disciplines came to this conclusion based on thousands of experiments, with dozens of revisions over centuries of acquiring evidence. No one answers radiometric dating because it was merely stated in some authoritative book. It was discovered. Science has no authorities, no scriptures.
You know, a lot of people think that carbon dating proves that the rocks are millions of years old.
It does seem to be common that people mix up the phrases carbon dating and radiometric dating. Radiometric dating is a broad term to describe a number of different dating methods, where carbon dating is specifically one of those methods. Just like painting might be considered a broad term, but watercolor paints are a specific type of paint with a specific purpose. It sounds like he's about to clear up the misunderstanding, but why is the graphic on the screen further confusing the point by showing the general phrase radiometric dating, while at the same time the speaker is talking about the specific carbon dating? Does the movie want to clear up the confusion between the two, or does it want to further confuse them in the audience mind?
Carbon dating is never used to date the rocks. It's only used to date former living things.
This is correct. The film will talk about useful timeframes for carbon-14 dating soon enough, but the main reason that carbon dating is never used to date the rocks is that carbon dating requires that the thing being studied is biological in origin and was once alive. Things like hides, cloth, wood, or plant fibers. When cosmic rays enter the Earth's atmosphere, they collide with atoms which create energetic neutrons, which in turn collide with nitrogen atoms. When this happens, a nitrogen-14, 7 protons, 7 neutrons, turns into a carbon-14 atom, 6 protons, 8 neutrons, and a hydrogen atom, 1 proton, 0 neutrons. This carbon-14 is absorbed by plants. As animals eat plants, they take in carbon-14 as well. The number of carbon-14 atoms in the air is tiny compared to the number of regular carbon-12 atoms. And while carbon-14 atoms are always decaying, they're being replaced by new carbon-14 atoms at a constant rate. As such, the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 at any given time is constant, be it in the air or in a living plant or animal. As soon as a living organism dies, it stops taking in new carbon-14. The ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 at the moment of death is the very same as any other living thing, but the carbon-14 continues to decay at a constant rate and is not replaced. As such, the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 in a sample can tell us how long it's been since that material stopped being alive. Since rocks were never alive, the carbon dating method would never work on rocks. Instead, we measure the age of the rocks with other radiometric dating methods like uranium, lead, potassium, argon, rubidium, strontium, uranium, thorium, and others.
No evolutionist uses carbon-14 because even if it worked the way they thought it did, it can only go out to 110,000 years max, even using the new accelerator mass spectrometer method.
The limitations of carbon dating have little to do with technology and everything to do with physics.
The half-life of carbon-14 is so short, only 5,730 years. You should not find any carbon-14 in anything older than 100,000 years should have even one atom we could detect.
Radioactive decay rates are expressed in terms of a half-life, the length of time that it takes for half of a sample to change form. For carbon-14, it takes 5,700 years for half of the parent, carbon-14, to change to the daughter, carbon-12. It takes another 5,700 years for the next half to change, 5,700 years for the next half, and so on. After 100,000 years, only one 262,144th of the original carbon-14 isotopes would remain in the sample. Certainly a number too small with which to infer an accurate count. 50,000 years is the standard estimate for the maximum age for which carbon dating can be useful.
The fact that people are routinely finding significant levels of C14 in all these different fossils indicates something wrong with dating methods.
All right, well, routinely finding significant levels of C14 in all these different fossils sounds like it should be very easy. I was unable to locate any peer-reviewed scientific literature to confirm these routine results, so I turned to creation literature. The primary related article at Answers in Genesis, called Carbon-14 in Fossils and Diamonds, from 2011 by AAGE staff geologist Andrew Snelling, seemed like a promising lead. The section called Radiocarbon in Fossils Confirmed didn't mention carbon-14 finds in dinosaur fossils. I just like dinosaurs and it would have made the subsequent research more fun, but rather points to a few instances of fossilized wood and one of ammonite shells. With no specific finds detailed, I took to the 7 footnotes to investigate further, only to find that all 7 references are the research of Andrew Snelling, the very same author of this article. Only a single source like this doesn't feel like routine finds. All the citations were from creation journals rather than peer-reviewed publications. The most recent and most interesting was this one from 2008 and included a summary of the history of carbon-14 in fossil finds, starting with a frequently cited 1970 Creation Research Society article by Robert Whitelaw. Snelling boasts that Whitelaw speaks of 15,000 samples that contained radiocarbon, but fails to mention that these 15,000 represented every single published carbon dating result in the then 20 years since the method's invention, explicitly including life both recent and ancient. Of these thousands, Whitelaw identified just 250 that he considered to be in the category of fossils, extinct fauna, and prehistoric man. And even this included many non-ancient sounding things like sloth dung, bison bone, and penguin bone. But by Snelling's own admission, the scientific community never took these anomalies seriously because these measurements were obtained using the beta decay counting technique. Beta decay counting technique from the pioneer days of the method that, among other issues, had trouble distinguishing between carbon-14 atoms and background cosmic rays. The accelerator mass spectrometer method, developed in the early 1980s, took over from beta decay counting. In Creation magazine Origins in 2001, Paul Geim identified 70 instances from 1984 to 1998 where carbon found was higher than carbon expected, in samples primarily marble, graphite, coal, and wood, not the materials people usually think of when they hear the word fossil. Geim allowed that contamination was a possible cause, and Snelling concedes that contamination during sample preparation was a genuine problem in this era. Indeed, during this time, Thomas Stafford and team studied such sources of error and found that the majority of bones that are used for radiocarbon dating and stable isotope analysis have undergone moderate to severe diagenesis and are often contaminated with substantial amounts of humates and other foreign organic matter. Since then, new methods of identifying and reducing contamination have been developed. Snelling provides no modern examples of locating radiocarbon in fossils, instead focusing on coal and diamonds, with the exception of his ammonite shell. Unfortunately, one of the well-known limitations of carbon-14 dating is usage on marine life. As this 2010 paper reminds its readers, marine shell carbonates are often considered problematic for radiocarbon dating. Problems most often identified include the reservoir effect, among numerous others. These marine shell pitfalls may well have been considered by Snelling on this ammonite find, but it is curious that his 22-page paper doesn't even contain the phrase reservoir effect in order to rule out the most commonly known complication. It's possible that there are genuine finds of original carbon-14 in fossils. However, if Terry's claim that significant levels of C14 are routinely found in fossils is true, and not just some repeated mantra, I'm curious as to why the large creation organizations like Answers in Genesis and Institute for Creation Research don't even have a few modern examples to present.
The half-life, the decay rate of carbon-14 is very short, so it's never used to date the rocks. It's the other methods, uranium changing into lead, potassium into argon, rubidium into strontium, and they have really long half-lives.
If you knew that, why did the movie spend time further confusing people about carbon-14?
All of those, including carbon-14, depend on four basic assumptions. One, you somehow have to be able to estimate the original amount of the parent isotope.
Wherever possible, modern radiometric dating is performed using the isochron method, specifically designed to remove any assumptions about the initial quantities of the parent and daughter isotopes. Like basic radiometric dating, the ratio of parent isotope to daughter isotope is measured. In addition, with the isochron method, multiple samples of minerals from the same pool of materials are taken. Rocks with a variety of minerals are best to find the amount present of a different isotope of the same daughter element. For example, strontium-86 compared to strontium-87. In practice, it turns out that the ratio of different isotopes of the same element is very close to constant in different materials found in the same rocks and formation. As such, this ratio of one daughter isotope to another can then serve as a comparison baseline. The ratio of parent isotope to daughter isotope is plotted against this daughter-to-daughter isotope ratio, and an age of the rock can be determined by noting the difference, without making any assumptions at all about the initial quantities of the parent and daughter material. This also serves as an excellent check against contamination. In other radiometric dating techniques, assumptions about the initial conditions are reasonable based on direct experimental observation. For example, argon is an inert gas which is generally expelled when crystals form, so potassium-argon dating can safely assume zero argon in crystals. Similarly, zircon rejects lead as it crystallizes. Variations in relative abundance of carbon-14 in the atmosphere can be cross-checked with other techniques like dendrochronology, and so on and so on.
2, you have to somehow calculate the original amount of the daughter isotope.
Again, this is the strength of the isochron method generally used. It requires no knowledge of the original amount of the daughter isotope.
There are little detective forensic ways, but no truly scientific method, rigorous ways.
What's the difference between forensic ways and scientific ways? Are you saying forensics isn't science? Inference and deduction can be equally reliable to direct observation to an extent that we're willing to convict citizens of crime based on the method's veracity. In fact, fingerprints, bullet striation, DNA, blood spatter, fire accelerants, and many other types of forensics are considered to be better evidence in court than eyewitness testimony, and much better than second-hand hearsay, which is what we have in the book of Genesis.
They also have to assume that the rate at which, for example, uranium decays into lead has always been constant, but they've only been measuring the decay rates for 100 years.
It is true that measurement of decay rates has been happening for only 100 years or so. This is as long as we've known about radioactive decay, and in that time, no variations have been found. How many years of observation do you think one would need in order to start using these observations to make predictions, and feeling confident when those predictions are affirmed? 500? 1,000? In a creationist time frame, 100 years is almost 2% of the entire age of the universe. That said, nature does have its own time machine in the form of light from distant stars. Whether you think that light left the star billions of years ago, or only thousands of years ago, it is showing us what the star was like much further in the past than 100 years. Astrophysical observations of the luminosity decays of distant supernovae, like nickel-56 to iron-56, strongly indicate that decay rates were the same then as they are now, extending our confidence that these rates have been consistent for the age of the stars themselves.
Pressure, magnetic fields, and heat can change the decay rates.
As a general rule, alpha and beta decay, the kind of decay used for most radiometric dating, is not, in any way, affected by even extreme changes in pressure, magnetic fields, or temperature. This has been affirmed over and over in published experiments with direct observation. A third type of decay, electron capture, also known as K-capture, which involves absorbing a particle rather than emitting particles, has been demonstrated to potentially slightly change under extreme pressure conditions, but by no more than 1%. Even so, of the flavors of radiometric dating, only potassium argon involves an electron capture process. A variance of less than 1% due to extreme conditions rarely found in nature is obviously not enough to explain the difference between 6,000 years and 4.3 billion years, particularly when most finds cross-reference multiple dating methods. I could find no confirmation of experimental data showing decay rate changes due to magnetic fields or heat, neither in peer-reviewed science publications, nor even in creation sources like Answers in Genesis or Institute for Creation Research. On these factors, Charles misspoke, is mistaken, or he knows of some data that even his creationist colleagues do not.
Radioactive lutetium decays 9 trillion times faster in the plasma state.
9 trillion? Charles is talking about something called bound state beta decay, a hypothesis proposed in 1947. Because protons in the nucleus and beta particles have opposite charges, they attract each other. So kinetic energy must be expended for the beta particle to escape. If the nucleus could be stripped of electrons, and thereby its charge, the beta particles might be able to escape much faster. Experiments to test this bound state beta decay hypothesis would have to wait until 1992, when dysprosium-163 was found to decay with holmium-163 with a half-life of just 47 days under bare nucleus conditions. Unfortunately, we can't compare this rate with normal conditions, as dysprosium-163 is normally stable and doesn't decay at all. More recently, an experiment demonstrated rhenium-187 decaying to osmium-187 with a 33-year half-life in bare nucleus conditions instead of the conventional 42 billion-year half-life. This is an amazing billion-fold increase. But even so, a billion is a much smaller number than 9 trillion that Charles threw out there.
And evolutionists, Big Bang theorists, believe the whole universe began in the plasma state.
Bare nucleus condition isn't synonymous with plasma state, and the role of plasma state in Big Bang cosmology is not settled. And to sustain this state requires heat levels that would melt the Earth instantly. But those quibbles aside, as we've learned, the radiometric clock doesn't start until a rock hardens. A theoretical hyper-fast decay rate in an ancient plasma state would have no influence on a rock now in solid state.
And one more, you have to assume the sample has been in a closed system the whole time.
With details depending on whether you're talking about physics, chemistry, thermodynamics, or another discipline. For the purposes here, a closed system would speak to a physical system where matter does not enter or leave. While few absolute closed systems exist in nature, when an igneous rock solidifies from magma, it approximates a closed system so closely that they produce consistent results across multiple radiometric dating methods, within 1%. Of course, geochronologists are fully aware of the possibilities of contamination, and a good portion of their effort is in reducing the impact of such contamination on the results, including utilizing multiple samples for cross-reference. When ages from such samples fall within 3% of each other, it is extremely unlikely that the same contamination would occur in the same proportion in each sample. Some of the methods have other error checking opportunities, like uranium-lead dating, where two different isotopes of uranium, 238 and 235, decay to different isotopes of lead, 206 and 207. If the system has remained closed, then plotting the two ratios will fall on a known line called the concordia. If they don't fall on the known line, there has been contamination. An absolute closed system is not a requirement or assumption. A close approximation to a closed system is something tested for.
Scientists who are well informed on this issue, PhDs in geology and physics.
Is this an attempt to appeal to authority? Charles may be aware of a handful of PhDs who doubt the veracity of radiometric dating, but certainly there is also an army of PhDs who would affirm it with equal vigor. What would we do in such a clash of PhDs? Scientific truth isn't determined by vote nor credentials. It's determined solely by the explanatory power and ability to make unique, accurate predictions about future data.
They say there's problems with every one of those assumptions.
By problems, do you mean the known limitations, parameters, potential pitfalls, useful circumstances, and techniques to minimize these issues for each of the assumptions? If so, then I would agree that not only are these so-called problems not only well known by PhD scientists, but they were also discovered and publicized by PhD scientists in geology, physics, or a related field. To date, no such problem has been discovered by a creation scientist, who have instead misrepresented the work of others in an effort to cast doubt on methods that are demonstrably and consistently reliable when applied appropriately.
Part 9. Dem Soft Bones.
In 2005, Mary Schweitzer.
Mary! If you've been watching this channel for a while, you may know that whenever Dr. Schweitzer comes up, I like to invoke a conversation I was in with her last year. Good morning, Dr. Schweitzer.
Morning.
Paleontologist and evolutionist.
It's true that Mary is both a paleontologist and she accepts biological evolution as the explanation for diversity of life we see today. But I wonder why the movie didn't mention that Mary considers herself a devoted Christian and a woman of God.
I am a Christian. I love the Lord.
In a movie about God, you'd think Mary's faith would be an important detail to include.
Made the first popularized discovery of soft tissues in a dinosaur bone.
While Mary's discoveries were significant and surprising, the characterization of the phrase soft tissue has misled some to believe that dinosaur finds are similar to what we might find at a butcher shop, or if not, then some overly stale dinosaur jerky from a convenience store shelf. Instead, we're actually talking about fragments of molecules, or even non-biological molecules where biological molecules once were.
Which include blood vessels and cells, DNA, and proteins, all of which decay quickly.
Blood vessels, cells, DNA, and proteins. Is that list correct, Mary?
It's wrong on all counts. It has to do with words. What do they mean by fresh DNA?
Good question. Let's go over each of those claims to look at what was actually found and if scientists have any ideas how they persisted over 65 million years.
Which include blood vessels.
Did you find blood vessels in dinosaur bones, Dr. Schweitzer?
It depends on how you define it. What is a blood vessel? How do you characterize a blood vessel? How do we know what we have?
In Mary's initial paper from 2005, the abstract described finding flexible hollow blood vessels, but the language of her continued work has become more precise, like this 2015 paper describing the find as structures similar to blood vessels in location, morphology, flexibility, and transparency.
Functionally, structurally, morphologically, you can't tell our dinosaur vessels apart from vessels studied similarly that are recent. So what do you mean?
Indeed. Does blood vessel mean the original blood vessel? Does bone mean original bone? just as fossilized bone generally refers to permineralized bone, where minerals have replaced the biological content of the bone over time, leaving basically a stone shaped like the original bone. The study of so-called soft tissue in fossils is focused on determining to what extent these finds are original biomaterial, called endogenous material in scientific literature, and to what extent it is merely remnants, or even replacement material. Unlike what a young Earth creationist may try to represent, complete endogenous biomaterial from the original animal is not what is found. Mary's 2015 paper affirms an analysis that endogenous vessel proteins are collagen peptides. This is unsurprising on two levels. First, collagen is the most abundant protein in animals. Second, collagen has a highly stable triple helix shape, 3 protein chains intertwining around each other, with extra reinforcement from multiple hydrogen bonds up and down the chain and cross-links at the end of the triple helix to further hold the peptide together. Recent research also shows that collagen benefits from a stereoelectronic effect, whereby the molecule's electronic structure also lends extra stability to its physical structure. All this to say, collagen is very robust, and despite what you may be led to believe, cellular biochemists find nothing unreasonable in collagen surviving hundreds of millions of years.
Collagen is a real robust molecule. It's kind of hangs out for a long time under normal circumstances. So in bone, it's orders of magnitude more lasting.
And cells.
The movie speaks generically of cells, but the creation literature speaks only of supposed blood cell finds. Dr. Schweitzer, has anyone found any blood cells in dinosaur bones?
Do we have blood cells? No, we do not have blood cells. I don't have the data to support that.
Mary's original 2005 paper described her findings as small round microstructures, and these microstructures have cell-like morphology. Again, cell-like is very different from actually being cells, as the Genesis movie might have you believe.
And that's what I mean. Words are really, really important. We have round red structures that localize to the blood vessel channels. They have the morphological characteristics of blood cells to have.
In the years since, we've come to learn that these round red circles were primarily composed of the iron from heme that is found naturally in the blood and has retained the size and shape of the blood vessels. Iron persisting is not a surprise in any timescale.
DNA.
Once again, the relevant paper is from Dr. Schweitzer.
It's the same thing with fresh DNA. What do you mean by that? Because we do have very rigorous evidence for DNA as the chemical in our dinosaur bone. And furthermore, it localizes using chemical methods to these osteocytes where you would expect it to be. But can I say it's dinosaur DNA? No, I can't, because it can be anything else on the planet unless I have sequence. And sequencing the DNA we pull out of our bones has so far proven to be impossible.
At best, what has been found are fragments of material consistent with DNA. No Jurassic Park for us in the near future, I'm afraid. But while the movie is willing to give us a maximally generous reading of the paper, to conflate consistent with DNA as the same as having DNA, but at the same time it ignores a large section on molecular mechanism for preservation, where the conditions of the find and properties of osteocytes are discussed at length.
And I've never figured out why people are more focused on these little red blood cells than they are on the osteocytes, which are way cooler.
That's true, Mary. The very chemistry that potentially affirms DNA comes with another conclusion that the film didn't mention. Antibodies from modern-day animals were used to attempt to bind to the DNA in order to prove that it was DNA. The one that worked was monoclonal antibody OB7.3, which is specific to avian osteocytes and does not bind to non-avian osteocytes. So at this molecular level, the T-Rex DNA fragments are bird DNA fragments. I wonder why the movie didn't want to link T-Rex and birds.
And proteins.
As every cell in the dinosaur is made up of proteins, this is a bit of a broad claim. While the word protein may cause the audience to conjure a mental image of a juicy steak, there are many types of proteins. We've already talked about the long-lasting collagen proteins associated with the vessel remnants. The other type of protein commonly found is keratin. Now, keratin is the structural protein that makes up hair, feathers, scales, horns, claws, and hooves. Next to bone, the most stable and long-lasting parts of animals. Now, keratin happens to be the substance where long-term survivability studies have been done, showing it to survive deep time in even the harshest conditions.
Mary Schweitzer herself said, "This flies in the face of everything we understand about how tissues and cells degrade. I can't explain it, to be honest."
This is something that was not expected. So what we've concentrated on is producing more and more evidence that these things belong to the dinosaur, but also asking alternative questions. Why? What is it that allows this kind of preservation? Can we address it?
Mary can't explain it, and neither can her colleagues.
Mary and her colleagues have spent the last 13 years running many experiments and publishing dozens of papers like those we've already referenced, each of which lays out evidence-backed hypotheses and explanations that the movie has simply ignored.
Yes, exactly. And the cool thing of it is, if we quit wasting time on how old these things are and start getting at why are they there, it has huge implications that go far beyond dinosaurs. And that's what kind of drives me is, okay, so these things persist in dinosaur bone. How come? You know, right now we're looking, we have a project going on where we're looking at all the conditions that might exist to preserve feathers and how long does it take for them to stabilize. And what we're finding is pretty darn cool.
Who cling to the evolutionary paradigm.
Are you just clinging to an evolutionary paradigm, Mary?
There is always additional data out there waiting to be discovered that could disprove your pet hypothesis. If you're doing science correctly, that has to be acknowledged in all your work. So rather than trying to prove something in spite of the facts, you try to disprove using data and only data. And if you can't do it, it still stands. It's not this big cloudy mystery that scientists are just sitting in their lab trying to figure out how to destroy Christian faith. Why would God try to trick us? It's like, okay, we're going to give you a brain and we're going to make a world of order. Because order is something God's known for. He's rational, he's consistent. So we're going to make this world of order, and then, wow, we're going to trick you by saying that all the rules that you can figure out with your brain no longer apply. God's not the deceiver in this. And I think that young earth creationists have to be really, really careful when they sit there and try to manipulate the data to support their worldview. That is not science. When I wear my science hat, I don't have beliefs. I have only data. It's very boring. But in the end, if my data is good enough, if my data are rigorous enough, if my data are repeatable enough, they can have their minds changed. And that is science. It isn't faith. That's science.
To illustrate the problem, let's travel back to the early 1700s, a time when biblical catastrophism was the accepted geological view.
When demons and bad smells were the accepted medical causes of disease. When digging holes was the accepted method to summon rain. When spontaneous generation was the accepted view of reproduction. When resemblance to a particular animal was the accepted rationale for human behavior. When a woman's ability to achieve orgasm was the accepted test for mental illness. Should we all prefer this golden era of scientific understanding from before the word scientist even existed?
If people then found a dinosaur bone, or dragon bone as they may have called it,
since the word dinosaur would not have been coined for another 100 years, it certainly does make sense that finding dinosaur bones could have fed dragon legends of the day.
With soft tissue and remnants of blood still in it.
Breaking open a dinosaur bone doesn't reveal the kind of soft tissue remnants we're talking about here. They're not visible to the naked eye. The equipment and technique to selectively dissolve in acid portions of the fossil did not exist back then. They would have found no such remnants, even if they were staring at it.
Would they be confused? Of course not.
They also weren't confused about why you find flies and maggots on dead plants and animals. They were very certain that they were born out of the dead material. They were wrong. Certainty of correctness is unrelated to actual correctness. As Mary indicated, it's out of confusion and curiosity that we make new discoveries.
They would simply conclude this was a creature that died and was buried during or after the flood, within the past few thousand years.
Or perhaps the more creative among them imagined wild fights with brave knights and swords.
Now let's fast forward to today. Would people be confused to find the same thing in a dinosaur bone?
The scientific community, not the young earth community, had the very appropriate response, which is total skepticism. I'm going to wait and see what the data say. And they required enormous and rigorous data, as they should. This is something that was not expected. And it, so what we've concentrated on is producing more and more evidence that these things belong to the dinosaur, but also asking alternative questions. Why? What is it that allows this kind of preservation? Can we address it?
Of course, many people would, because the evidence we find doesn't match the evolutionary timescale we've been conditioned to believe.
It does not honor God to go down that road and follow that lineage. It's not important. If these guys would take half the energy that they spend trying to prove that the world is young and use it to change the world around them, feed the hungry, take care of the kids, get the cats off the street, anything, that our world would be so much better. But they waste so much time and energy and effort on disproving that the world is old. It's not a salvation issue.
Notice that this section of the film doesn't include any of their scientists at all, not even schoolteacher Charles. Only the narrator was willing or able to make these vague claims. So thank you, Mary, for bringing some scientific expertise to the proceedings.
Part 10. Natural Selection Selects.
Many textbooks say,
Again with textbooks? What is the obsession with textbooks?
the peppered moth industrial melanism in England is evolution. Well, if that's all evolution is, I believe.
That's not all evolution is? But a common definition of biological evolution is the change in allele frequencies in a population over time, where allele refers to the variant forms of a gene sequence. So the peppered moth situation is an example of evolution, but it is not all it is.
The dark-colored peppered moths actually were more camouflaged than the light-colored peppered moths. As a result, the birds could see them and eat them for lunch a lot easier. It's not an evolutionary event at all. It's a natural selection event.
It is commonly explained that evolution is a process that takes place by means of genetic variation and natural selection. Charles is right to say that biological evolution and natural selection are not synonyms for each other, but that the latter is a contributor to the former. Just like bread isn't synonymous with a sandwich, but bread contributes to a sandwich. So Charles might have a point in identifying an event as demonstrating the natural selection mechanism only. We'll have to see where he goes with this.
Natural selection means to pick or choose, to select from what is already there. Traits that were already there, genetic information that was already there.
So far, so good.
This process will never get you from copepod sort of things in the ocean turning into moths. It will never get you from monkeys turning into people. This process can't make one step in that.
Just like bread alone doesn't make a sandwich, natural selection alone doesn't equal evolution, as Charles notes. For some reason, Charles is missing the genetic variation half of the explanation. When organisms reproduce, there are typically mutations in the DNA. For example, it is estimated that each human has, on average, 60 to 100 mutated differences from our parents' DNA. Most of these mutations end up being neutral, having no noticeable effect. Sometimes, the mutation ends up being harmful to the organism. Other times, the mutation might give the organism some kind of advantage in life in their current environment. It is upon these advantageous genetic mutations that natural selection acts. Organisms with an advantage will have more children. Therefore, those advantage alleles will eventually become more common.
Natural selection may be able to explain the survival of the fittest, but it cannot explain the arrival of the fittest.
Just a note that the phrase survival of the fittest doesn't necessarily have anything to do with strength or power. Instead, it has everything to do with adaptation to an environment to have more offspring. Longer fur might be an advantage in a cold climate and a disadvantage in a hot climate.
How did we get moths in the first place is the question evolution claims to answer and can't and doesn't.
So Charles started this segment by insisting that natural selection alone isn't the same as evolution, which is partially correct. But now he's done a complete 180 by saying that because natural selection alone doesn't explain something, therefore evolution can't explain that thing. Going back to our sandwich analogy, Charles said that bread isn't a sandwich, and because bread alone isn't a sandwich, then a sandwich can't be a sandwich.
The types of changes that we're seeing that lead to variation with kinds.
Variation within kinds is creationist code for any evolutionary observations that humans have documented, so would be difficult to deny. Things like the domestication of the dog from wolves, selective breeding to produce modern bananas or broccoli, or bacteria developing resistance to antibiotics,
are not the types of changes that are required by evolution. There is variation within the kind, but not evolution of one kind becoming another kind.
Since creationists can no longer deny that evolution is an observable phenomenon in modern day, and not merely guesses about the past, they've chosen to embrace the idea to certain extents, and now often speak of created kinds.
In the creation account, it says that God created according to their kind. After their kind.
The idea is that God created a relatively small number of organisms during creation week, maybe 8,000 or so distinct kinds, and that small number were preserved on Noah's Ark, But then, after the flood, the offspring of these kinds began to rapidly produce variations into all the species of animals we see today. By one estimate, this hypervariation would have had to have produced 11 new species every single day just to account for it all. Where various methods like genetics, morphology, and the fossil record produce independent yet corroborating phylogenetic trees that demonstrate a single tree of life and how all life on the planet share common ancestors, the creationist model posits an orchard of life, where God is said to have made the base kinds independently of each other, but phylogenetic trees offshoot from each of those seemingly arbitrary breaks. The trouble is that there are clear genetic connections between these root nodes that baraminology, the fancy name for the study of created kinds, proposes, and these connections include specific mutations and precisely located virus-caused damage, shared by different nodes, and cannot be reasonably explained away as the work of a common designer.
Not through evolutionary processes. You don't have one kind developing into another kind. They're all created according to their kind.
Georgia is positing that no node from one branch in the orchard would be born so different from its parent that it couldn't be part of the same tree in their diagram. The featured speakers in this film seem to be under the mistaken impression that such an event would be predicted with the single tree evolutionary model, but this couldn't be further from the truth. And we will talk more about this perpetuated misconception momentarily. At this point, though, I would note the frustration many have with the lack of definition of created kind, and that without precise definition, it seems that the claim that one kind cannot change to another kind is impossible to either refute or verify. One might as well argue that a pile can never become a mound, but refusing to attach measurable definitions to either word.
Yes, you can have great variation within a kind, you can get different species forming, which is what Darwin really saw.
Again, the movie is forced to acknowledge that we have observed speciation events in nature. This is when two populations are descendants from a single population, but have changed so much that they are no longer able to interbreed. Geographical separation of the two populations over an extended period of time is a common factor. Examples of modern speciation documented by science include three-spined sticklebacks, North and South Rim Grand Canyon squirrels, and the London underground mosquito. One of my favorite new species appeared only in the last year, a crayfish whose genetic mutation gave it the ability to have babies without male involvement. Essentially, she gives birth to clones of herself, and she's taking over European waterways. Cool, right?
But there are limits.
I'm curious as to what these limits are. What is the chemical or biological mechanism that stops these so-called variations from going too far? Articles like this one at Answers in Genesis assert the same claim, that genetic variation has limits, but it neither specifies the boundaries nor even suggests how such a boundary is enforced. Let's say that a genetic mutation that leads to a variation in a population represents a single step. The movie's speakers would acknowledge that some variations in nature must represent at least 2 steps, maybe 3, maybe 4, 5. If a person can take 5 steps, they can simply repeat that until they've walked a mile, and walk across the country. What would such a journey be other than a series of single steps? If there is something preventing variation steps from accumulating into a significant evolutionary journey, what is that something? Can it be demonstrated? How does it work?
Dogs always remain dogs. Cats always remain cats.
I presume that when Ken and other creationists say that dogs will always remain dogs, that they're deliberately, or accidentally, implying that evolution would claim something otherwise. That evolution predicts that non-dogs would come from dogs. But this couldn't be further from the truth. A dog giving birth to a non-dog would completely invalidate biological evolution. Let's explore a few analogies, though admittedly imperfect ones, to see if we can clear up this confusion just a little. If you use a computer, you've undoubtedly worked with a folder-based file system. If you have a top folder A, you could make subfolders B, C, and D, all of which are part of folder A. If you make some subfolders in B, perhaps B1, B2, and B3, those are all in folder B, but are also still part of folder A. Subfolder C1 would also be a part of A, but not a part of B. Yet another layer of subfolders, B1A and B1B, are, unsurprisingly, still a part of B1, B, and A. And you would never expect to make a subfolder in B1B that was somehow also a subfolder of D. So it is with evolution. Every organism inherits from all the organisms in the nodes before it, but no organism just jumps to an entirely different branch. We know that in the 3rd century, there were a group of Europeans who spoke a language called Latin. Over the course of the centuries, these Latin speakers moved to different parts of the continent, and their languages adapted independently into branches including Italian, Spanish, and French. Despite the common Latin history, the French and the Spanish could eventually no longer understand each other. At no point in this history did a set of Latin-speaking parents raise a Spanish-speaking baby. Yet Spanish is obviously descended from Latin. Suppose a group of French speakers left to colonize Mars, and we were to visit them in, say, 500 years. They would likely be speaking a language called Martien. They would not be fully understood by earthbound French speakers, but would be obviously derived from French. Yet at no point on that journey would a French speaker give birth to a Martien speaker. And so it is with evolution. Anyone who thinks that dogs don't give birth to non-dogs is an evolution-refuting statement is drastically confused about the claims that evolution makes, and should sincerely seek out a better understanding of what an evolutionist actually believes. Suppose you have a friend whose favorite color is blue, and you would like them to join you in having orange as the favorite color. If you were to spend your time telling your blue-loving friend how terrible green is, they'd become confused, annoyed, and likely never see your point of view on the greatness of orange. You have to accurately know and address someone's actual opinion if you care to change their mind.
The fact of the matter is the information is stronger than it's been ever. In the past 5 years, there's been a quantum jump in the data, the new discoveries that actually go against evolutionary thinking and make it more and more preposterous.
It would have been nice if you would have pointed to some examples, Charles, rather than asking us to take you at your word. What is this new data? Is Eric saving this data for a sequel, so you're trying to avoid spoilers?
The creationists are finding more and more ammunition in the new scientific data, not theories, in the data, which prompted Eugenie Scott to say, facts are a dime a dozen. Theories are what matter in science.
Anytime an expert is quoted, particularly an expert who disagrees with the person doing the quoting, it's a good idea to check the context of the quote. What does Eugenie Scott have to say about facts and theories?
You know, the terms that we use in science are used very specifically in science as terms of art, but they have very different meanings on the street, and this is a source of a lot of confusion. When scientists talk about fact, they're talking about confirmed observations, and facts are interesting, but they're not terribly exciting. They don't do a whole lot for you. Facts are a dime a dozen. There's facts all over the place. A hypothesis is a testable statement. You're saying, you know, what's the relationship between this and this? And you go out and test it, and you either accept or reject your statement of that relationship. Hypotheses are very useful. They're very helpful. They help us build theory. Theories are the most important things in science. Theory to a scientist means explanation. And these are logical constructs of facts, of tested hypotheses, of laws, of all kinds of stuff that, taken together and put in a logical descriptive fashion, help us understand some kind of natural phenomenon. Most lay people think that theories are guesses or hunches or something that you don't have to take terribly seriously. It's not such a big deal. Completely opposite in science. Theories are the most important things in science. What a lot of, unfortunately, textbooks lead people to misunderstand is that a really good theory grows up into a law, as if theories are refined and then become laws, and laws are somehow more important than theories. In science, actually, laws are just descriptive generalizations. They're very useful, they're very helpful. They're not as important as theories, because theories explain laws. So in general, the hierarchy of explanation is very different in science than it is in the general public. The general public puts facts on top, laws next, hypotheses, and then theories. Maybe theories and hypotheses can move around a little bit. In science, on the other hand, theories are the most important thing. Laws are next most important. Hypotheses are next most important. And perhaps the least most important part of a scientific explanation is facts, because facts are a dime a dozen. And facts don't explain anything.
Here's why we believe this, and it's not just faith. We have science. It's really on our side.
This is a particularly bold statement in the context of a section of the film that put forth no scientific findings whatsoever to support a creationist framework, but instead merely stomped its feet in incredulity at a misrepresentation of a model with unprecedented explanatory and predictive power. But they had to include the line in the movie. It was in all the trailers.
Part 11, Planet of the Ape Men.
And God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind. Cattle and creeping thing."
According to the film, The animals God created during Creation Week were representatives of a few thousand created kinds, which went on to diversify into the millions of species we see today, which allows for some explanation for the undeniable progression of animals through the fossil record. While the Ark Encounter attraction acknowledges this by using the oldest forms of an animal that creationists will acknowledge, for example, this known horse ancestor, the Mesohippus, to represent the horse kind, the Genesis Paradise Lost movie instead chooses the most modern versions of the animals, like these horses. This is presumably to immediately visually read for their audience, but it undermines the work of creationists who are attempting to be taken seriously in this field. Eric's movie does include this zebra-striped horse, a minimal acknowledgement of the creationist idea that all the genes for all the variations were present from the first.
And beast of the earth after his kind.
Again, these hopping kangaroos seem to be modern kangaroos, where Bearmanology, the fancy name for the study of created kinds, admits that genetics show that kangaroo and wallabies must be of the same kind, so both would have descended from something like this non-hopping kookaroo.
And God made the beast of the earth after his kind.
Of course, the film had to include dinosaurs, starting with these two sauropods stomping on trees. Very iconic. The next shot, though, are two lumbering dinosaurs I had trouble identifying, even after enlisting help from biologists, with Melanorosaurus, Proceropod, and Sauropodomorph our best guesses. Unfortunately, all of these possibilities are acknowledged ancestors of the sauropods from the previous shot, which would obviously be of the same created kind if such an idea held, so their inclusion here back-to-back seems unresearched. This spotted and striped and maned member of the cat kind is another demonstration of Eric's idea how genetic diversity should be represented on screen. And even though scientists in the very next section of the film are going to acknowledge that modern apes are variations of more ancient apes, the 3D artist depicted a modern ape for this transition scene. It seems the film was more concerned with familiarity than science that even the creationists in the film acknowledge.
Evolutionists believe that...
I'm not sure who these evolutionists are, but it's better than atheist or secularist or some other terms they sometimes use, since the majority of people on Earth who accept the reality of evolution are, in fact, self-proclaimed Christians. We don't have gravityists or protonists. Scientists are convinced would be a better phrase than evolutionists believe.
Approximately 5 million years ago, humans and today's apes shared a common ancestor, like here, a fork in the road. That creature is often referred to as an ape-like creature. They don't like to call it an ape because they're going to argue that this creature evolved into apes, and apes evolving into apes is not impressive.
I have to disagree. I'm fully awed and impressed by the diversity of apes that came from those early apes. The gorillas, orangutans, chimps, humans, and more. You see, all of those things are still apes.
I'm prepared to accept that ape-like creatures produced apes. I have a little trouble with the idea that ape-like creatures became humans, and of course that's the whole realm of the ape men.
So David acknowledges change in populations over time, but has trouble with too many changes. This is not unlike accepting that a human can walk for a mile, but denying that a human could walk across a state, for some reason. Unfortunately, the film doesn't take time to let us know how many changes are too many, or what the mechanism is that prevents too many changes. As for ape men, humans are multicellular, lack cell walls, ingest and digest food, and as such, humans are animals. Is that okay, David? Humans have a backbone, and as such are vertebrates. Is that okay, David? Humans have 3 middle ear bones, a lower jaw, body hair, a thoracic diaphragm, and a 4-chambered heart, and as such are mammals. Is that okay, David? Humans have hands and feet, opposable thumbs, flexible shoulders and hips, a clavicle, and the capacity of standing on hind legs, and as such are primates. Is this still okay, David? Humans have a hairless face, protrusive lips, flat nails, lack a tail, have a shortened spine relative to body length, broad hips, and a wide chest, and as such are apes. Modern humans are apes. Ultimately, the phrase ape man makes no more or less sense than mammal man or vertebrate man.
You see, what the Bible says, what Genesis says, is that on the 6th day of the world, God made 2 humans, he made a whole bunch of monkeys, he never made any monkey humans. But that's what they're always looking for in the fossils.
What they look for in the fossils are fossils. Do you suppose that paleontologists are tossing aside ancient bones because they don't meet expectations? Perhaps from an angel or a snake that can talk?
And one by one, all of the different so-called missing link fossils have been reclassified as either over to the human side or over to the monkey side.
In a discussion about subtle nuances in biological study, he's using the word monkey as if it's interchangeable with ape. Monkeys have tails, where apes do not. Monkeys have skeletal structures more like dogs, cats, and other 4-footed animals, and so on. They're an entirely different taxonomical line. As we've talked about before, all of the hominids are apes. Perhaps this seems picky of me to point out in most contexts, but this film is attempting to present biological evidence for a point of view. There's some basic terminology that goes along with non-superficial discussion. Using monkey here is either ignorance or an attempt to further confuse the issue and create a straw man. Let's do a quick tour of the 6 most prominent ape-to-human extinct transitional species currently known, so that we can see which ones have been reclassified and when. We'll use the principle of charity to assume that Charles means the genus Homo when he says human side, and the genus Australopithecus when he says monkey side. Note that modern chimps, gorillas, and orangutans are an entirely different genus from all of these. Ardipithecus ramidus, discovered in 1992, classified in 1994, and still has the same classification. Australopithecus afarensis, discovered in 1974, classified in 1978, and still has the same classification. Australopithecus africanus, discovered in 1924, classified in 1925, and still has the same classification. Homo habilis, discovered in 1959, classified in 1964, and still has the same classification. Though in fairness, the discovery of new specimens in 1986 did spark some debate about whether it should be in the genus Homo or Australopithecus, but after all said and done, it still has the same classification. Homo erectus, discovered in 1891, classified in 1894 as Pithecanthropus erectus. But the change to Homo erectus was merely a renaming of Pithecanthropus to Homo in the 1930s, not an actual classification change. In the last 120 years, new specimen finds have had hotly contested classification debates, but always considering species within the Homo genus, never considering Australopithecine grouping. Homo heidelbergensis, discovered in 1907, classified in 1908, and still has the same classification. Nothing has been reclassified, let alone one by one.
Lucy, the Australopithecus afarensis, discovered by Donald Johanson in 1973. Johanson himself said Lucy has really been dethroned.
If we've learned one thing from this movie, it may be that we should check the context any time Charles quotes someone. Now, I found this snippet from Donald Johanson in this National Geographic article from practically pre-internet March 1996. The article is specifically about the importance of the Australopithecus afarensis finds, so the quote is particularly curious. And here we find it, on page 20 of a 20-page spread. And from what throne has the specific specimen dubbed Lucy been dethroned? Here's the paragraph. Lucy was dethroned as the oldest specimen, because another team found a human ancestor older than Lucy. Scientists are finding even older, even more comprehensive, even more numerous discoveries that affirm human evolution than that original Lucy find. More evidence, not less evidence.
Meet Lucy. The nasal bones do not protrude. Do you notice any slope at all to the face? Of course. Here, the zygomatic arch to the slope, clearly ape-like. What about the forehead? Is it flat or curved? Absolutely flat. When we look from the side, the bone comes way out on this flat forehead, and it's very difficult to see whether there are orbits or eye sockets viewed from the side. Finally, cranial capacity. Lucy has a small brain by ape standards, never mind human.
These are true things. These are features of the Australopithecus afarensis skulls. These are the key ways that the species is more like other apes than modern humans. The elongated skull with small brain case, sloped face and jaw, long arms and hands with curved fingers. We could equally highlight the ways Australopithecus afarensis are more like humans. Spine connection under the skull, shape of the pelvis, angled thigh bones, and arched feet. By focusing entirely on the skull, The film is deliberately leaving out all the reasons that scientists claim that Lucy is a transitional form. If a position is to be taken seriously, it needs to account for all of the data, not just the parts of the data that are convenient.
Lucy had a brain 1/3 the size of ours.
There's no special reason that an increased brain size would have had to have occurred early in the process. Divergence in other physicality likely predated and accommodated the eventual increase in brain size. Nothing in evolution would require these changes to be simultaneous.
At full growth, a full-grown woman, only 65 pounds, 3.5 feet tall. This was a chimp.
It doesn't follow that because she was short that she was therefore a chimp. Obviously, there are shorter and taller specimens in any species. It's the morphology that tells the tale.
And the drawings and these skeletal diagrams of her standing upright, this probably would have been very unnatural and painful, knowing now what we know about the toe bones being curved more than a modern chimp.
In 2011, a paper documenting a complete fourth metatarsal discovered in Hadar, Ethiopia, showed that Australopithecus afarensis had the same transverse arch and longitudinal arch as humans, supporting the hypothesis that this species was a committed terrestrial biped. The only newer paper on the subject is this one from 2016, which documented fossilized Australopithecus afarensis tracks and affirmed very human-like, fully bipedal biology and walking pattern.
With a divergent big toe is what they're calling it now, as they've discovered more of the fossils. That means a thumb on the foot.
There are no peer-reviewed papers that support this claim from Charles. The closest is this one from Nature in 2012, which talks about an African fossil find with an opposable great toe, but the article specifically calls out that this is not from Lucy's Australopithecus afarensis species. If I expand the search to include non-reviewed creationist literature, the curved toe claim is traced back to this 1987 article by Duane Gish. He cites no source at all for his assertion that Australopithecus afarensis had curved toes. Even if this were the best knowledge way back in 1987, the 2011 findings are obviously newer, the complete opposite of Charles' claim about what we know now.
It seems incredibly clear that Lucy was just a type of chimpanzee.
Whatever else we could say about Lucy, she is an ape.
We could similarly say, whatever else we could say about humans, they are apes, or mammals, or invertebrates. We meet all of these definitions. What you cannot say, and what David carefully did not say, is that Lucy is a chimp, like the line given to the non-scientist narrator to say. David is playing a little fast and loose with similar-sounding terminology to remain scientifically accurate, while still seeming to affirm the film's conclusions, in the hope that the audience won't notice.
Let's look at another presumed ancestor of man, or a pre-Homo sapiens. It's Neanderthal man.
Once again, Dr. Menton fondles a recreation of an ancient skull in order to point out the similarities between the skulls of two species, so that he might conflate them as the same species, despite the fact that the reasons to think they are different are in lines of evidence outside of the skull. For Neanderthals, this even includes DNA evidence, where the genome differences from humans are clearly defined. This exercise is not different than superficially pointing out that if you look at a car and a truck from the front, that they both have a windshield and headlights and tires, and thereby proclaim that cars and trucks are exactly the same thing without looking at any other angle. The film took this skull comparison one step further, from the realm of physical specimens to digital ones. The skulls were admittedly scaled to the animator's choice and passed into one another to highlight the similarity of Lucy to chimp and Neanderthal to man. When I speak to people who have seen this movie, this particular scene seems to have resonated most memorably with them. But even a layperson can see some differences as these skulls pass through, differences beyond mere sizing. An untrained eye can't tell the difference between a bear skull, a dog skull, and a cat skull. Why would we rely on our untrained eye to spot the important differences between these hominid skulls, as the computer graphics used quickly smash them into obscurity? By focusing on skulls, the film ignores all the reasons scientists have for classifying these species as they do. Perhaps you will be more interested in these reasons than the film is, and investigate for yourself.
The hypoglossal nerve is the same size in Neanderthals as in modern people today. Monkeys have just a little thin thread-like nerve. They have the hardware, they just don't have the software drivers to actually talk.
If apes and humans were created as entirely distinct kinds by a creator god, why would he have given apes, chimps, and monkeys the same physical mechanisms for speech if he didn't want them to speak? Why would God want to trick us with every appearance of common ancestry with apes by including common parts that aren't even used? Why did Charles think that this would be a good detail to include?
I don't know if you've ever heard a monkey play a flute, but it really doesn't work.
How about a gorilla playing a recorder?
Can you blow it louder?
Or a monkey playing guitar. What are we talking about again?
Today, the scientific designation, the classification for Neanderthal man is Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. And that third word is actually the designation of the variety of humans that it is.
The classification Homo sapiens neanderthalensis was never widely accepted and exists only in a handful of papers from the late 1980s and early 1990s, and is in no peer-reviewed sources at all after the first sequencing of Neanderthal DNA in 1997. That sealed the deal that Neanderthals were their own species. Even in the most generous interpretation, it seems Charles is 20 years out of date.
Everyone's been told that there are dozens and dozens of these solid, mesolink fossils, transitional forms.
Let's talk a little bit about transitional forms and what one might look like. Let's skip the emotion and baggage of the biology we're used to and imagine a world where the dominant life form are blue squares. When these shapes reproduce, the child shape is never exactly the same as the parent shape. There are also red trapezoids on their world, but they are not as numerous. As the blue squares examine their world, the oldest remains they find are red trapezoids with no blue squares. But they do find bodies that are 90% red and 50-degree angle base, bodies that are 70% red and a 60-degree angle base, bodies that are 30% red and a 75-degree angle base, bodies that are 10% red and an 85-degree angle base. But they have yet to find a body that is precisely 50% red with a 67.5-degree angle base. Therefore, all the bodies are slightly more square, slightly more trapezoid, slightly more red, or slightly more blue. Have these shapes ever found transitional forms between red trapezoids and blue squares, or have they not? What do you think counts as a transitional form?
Oh, so-and-so man.
So-and-so man? Really? I'm going to call this argument by dismissive language. Maybe he should just say fossil schmossels or evolution schmevolution.
Java man and Piltdown man and
Cro-Magnon man, Neanderthal man, essentially all of Homo erectus would be just human beings.
But morphology and even gene sequencing tells us that these creatures were not modern humans. They are distinct from human, despite being more similar to humans than other creatures. Would you like to dismiss a cheetah as just a lion or a buffalo as just a cow? A biologist would not. Nor would the cheetah or the buffalo when choosing a mate.
Don't just believe urban myths of the proofs of evolution like junk DNA.
I'm not going to go into detail here, but junk DNA was an unfortunate term given to non-coding DNA, DNA that does not encode protein sequences. The existence of non-coding sequences has been pointed to by some as evidence of a lack of design, but we are still in the infancy of DNA research, and some are suggesting that these regions play other roles like regulation. So it's not necessarily a great anti-design argument. It can be a short-sighted position in science to declare that something can't happen, like the gentlemen in the movie who assert that mutations can't add up.
Like missing link fossils.
I think we've covered that.
The secular world teaches that you evolved from some ape-like ancestor.
The majority of the Christian world teaches this as well.
That there was no Adam and Eve. Oh, and since there's no Adam and Eve, well, then there was no fall into sin, which means there's no need for a savior.
While this may or may not be true, it is merely an argument from consequence. The consequences of something being true has no impact on whether it is, in fact, true. A lot of times, things with bad consequences are true.
So see, the secular anthropology not only does it attack the authority of the Bible, it attacks the very gospel itself.
Again, millions of Christians around the world would disagree with you on this, Bodie. They accept the reality of evolution and also call themselves Christians. I mean, I'm kind of with you. I think the lack of an actual Adam and Eve is a bit of a problem for the Bible in general, but we're just here to talk about the science. At least I am.
Part 12. Vegisaurus.
One of the common misconceptions that exists in society is that they say that humans and chimps are 99% similar.
Depending on the study and methodology, I've been able to find numbers anywhere from 96% to 99% similarity in the DNA of humans and chimpanzees. But I suspect that Andrew isn't looking to quibble over 3%.
I am very disillusioned by the idea of using a percentage to describe how similar humans and chimps are. You cannot use a percent similarity to describe common ancestry.
I have discussed this with geneticists, and they generally agree that while percentage similarity is a useful way to communicate the concept, no single number can express all of the subtleties. For example, most people would probably agree to a method of expressing percent similarity in these two sentences where one letter is different. But what about these two sentences where the word brown appears twice? How similar are they? 1 word difference? 5-letter difference? Everything after the 3rd word different because it's not aligned? Or this one where 1 word is missing? Is that one difference or many? Evolutionary biologists use many metrics in determining ancestry relationships. These insertion, deletions, and transposition events are the most interesting. Molecular phylogenetics focuses on model-based analysis where variations in the data are measured against the predictions of models of sequence evolution.
It's not too surprising that our chromosomes look a lot the same as a chimpanzee's. Of all other living things, their biochemistry, their physiology, their body structures look the most like us. Their DNA ought to look the most like us too. For goodness sake, bananas have DNA that's 50% the same as ours. So that monkeys should have 80, 90, 98% the same DNA. Their bodies look that much like ours.
Wait, the movie cut from someone saying DNA percentages are suspect to someone else telling us the DNA percentages are exactly what is expected. Which is it?
One of the most popular misconceptions held by evolutionists is that birds evolved from dinosaurs. What proof do they have, you might ask? Well, just look at their similar design, they might say.
They might say that, but scientists generally don't speak of design other than in a casual sense. They'd be more likely to point out common traits, divergent traits, and how these vary over time.
Pointing out that both birds and some dinosaurs have hollow bones.
They might also point out skeletal similarities in the neck, pubis, shoulder blade, clavicle, and breastbones, theropod lung air sacs being closer to birds than reptiles, that over 30 species of non-avian dinosaurs have been found with feathers or protofeathers, both have gastroliths, gizzard stones in the digestive system, that there is a progression of hand configuration, shrinking then losing 5th and 4th digits, the 1st and 2nd digit fusion allowing for the wing joint movement that creates thrust, and that the T-Rex soft tissue osteocytes the movie was so excited about bind only with modern avian proteins, not with reptile proteins. They might further point to species like Archaeopteryx that may seem bird-like, but simultaneously have reptile features like teeth and a bony tail. That's just to name a few. It's not just hollow bones.
But common features can also be understood as evidence for a common designer who didn't need to reinvent the wheel every time he created a new kind.
If you posit an all-powerful being who could create using literally any method, then affirmation of a particular method doesn't actually lend evidence to that hypothesis. If we're playing a game of guess my number between 1 and 1,000, and the first person guesses 682, while the second person guesses the set of all possible integers, and my number is indeed 682, the second person can delude themselves into thinking they made an equally good prediction, but they clearly did not. Since an all-powerful God could just as easily have made each kind entirely genetically unique with no additional effort on his behalf, that would be much stronger evidence for a creator, since it would entirely rule out evolution with common ancestry. If God is the creator, he chose a creation method that is indistinguishable from evolution.
Humans and frogs both have 5 digits on their lower limbs.
As do horses, cats, bats, birds, and whales.
But that doesn't mean frogs and humans share a common ancestor.
This study in 2010 was among the first to sequence the genome of the frog, specifically Xenopus tropicalis. Not only were the similarities between frogs and humans striking, as well as chickens, as happened to be included in the study, they found over 1,700 genes in the frog that matched genes in humans associated with specific diseases such as cancer, asthma, and heart disease. Of course, from an evolutionary perspective, this is easily explained by a common ancestor of the frog and the human having these gene sequences which were then passed along to both lines. But if you believe that humans and frogs were created perfectly, then these disease genes can't be part of the original creation, and instead must be the result of harmful gene mutations that began with original sin. Much like rolling 2 clay pots down a flight of stairs, we are unsurprised that both are broken. But we would be very surprised to find that both clay pots broke exactly the same way, into the same number of pieces in precisely the same shapes, right down to the molecular level. So it is with frog and human DNA. While one can potentially explain remarkable genetic similarities with a common designer, it is very difficult to explain identical undesigned damage taking place after the initial design was complete. For this, only common ancestry makes sense.
Unless you believe fairy tales, of course.
I'm not sure that the film with the book about talking snakes should attempt to belittle findings by calling them fairy tales. If we're having an honest presentation about science, let's stick to science.
God made the world perfect. There was no death or bloodshed according to Genesis 1:29-30. Originally, all the animals were vegetarian and mankind was vegetarian.
When being told that all animals were created to be vegetarian, one's mind naturally turns to all the carnivore-specific features found in the animal kingdom. sharp serrated teeth, speed for the hunt, claws to kill, inability to synthesize essential nutrients on their own, and a physiology that can't digest plant matter. The animation segments of the film gives a tip of the hat to this, depicting a fierce T-Rex stomping toward the camera with its curved, serrated, perfect for killing teeth, lunging toward us in full 3D effect, only to cut away at the last second to said T-Rex pulling a watermelon-like fruit dangling from the branch of a tree. Just as an aside on watermelons, they grow from vines on the ground, not hanging high. An average watermelon weighs 20 pounds, far too heavy to be dangling from the flimsy branches presented. I know the film wants us to rethink what God might have done with biology, but surely the laws of physics would still apply. Eric's T-Rex gulps the watermelon down without chewing, making me wonder why it needed an entire mouthful of teeth to merely pluck a fruit that won't fight back. It's not so much that carnivorous features can't work in other situations, but rather that the entire creationist movement argues for perfection in design and purpose, when clearly what is being proposed is that God made creatures designed to eat meat, but had them make do to be vegetarians for a while. This tells me that before God created people, he adapted his animal design in advance to be best suited for life after sin that had not yet occurred.
This golden age of the past, reported to us accurately in the Bible, is remembered in the legends of human cultures throughout our history.
The reason we call certain stories legends is that they are acknowledged to be fictional, not true, or based on a true story that has become exaggerated over time.
Where man and animals grew to be larger and live much longer than we do today.
Of course, among the easiest details to exaggerate is size and age. We'll talk later about size, but the claim here of legendary advanced age is not supported by any empirical evidence. As far as we know, human lifespans have only lengthened over the centuries.
Scientific discoveries reveal fossil representatives of every major kind of plant and animal that are many times larger than their present-day counterparts.
It's not clear to me why larger animals would indicate that animals are closer to perfection.
Fossil insects as large as modern dogs.
The largest known insects were the Meganeuropsis griffinflies, with up to 27-inch wingspans. The Picurtinensis scorpion is thought to have reached over 2 feet in length, and there are other pretty crazy examples. During the Carboniferous and Permian periods, Earth's air contained 31 to 35% oxygen, as compared to just 21% oxygen in the air today, and the climate is also estimated to have been warmer and moister. Since insects don't have lungs, but rely on air flowing through spherical openings across their bodies for oxygen, their potential size is directly proportional to oxygen in the air. Such giant insects were fine then, but could not survive today.
Fossil birds with 25-foot wingspans.
Close enough. The largest wingspan of any fossil found is the single specimen we have for Pelagornis sandersi, measuring 24 feet, dating back about 25 million years.
And fish as big as our modern whales.
The estimated size of the lead cichthys was once in the 90-foot long range, based on incomplete skeletons, which would have put the fish close to the size of whales. However, newer research since 2013 suggests the adults were probably more like 26 to 50 feet long. Still massive and still the largest species of fish known, but not quite whale category.
So if evolution's true, you've got millions of years of death before man sinned to bring about death.
We really have a huge theological problem if we accept those millions of years.
This sentence demonstrates the problem with science proposed in this movie and in the young Earth creation view in general. If evolution is true, we have a theology problem. Since we can't have a theology problem, evolution is false. The consequences of an idea are irrelevant to the truth of the idea. If a cancer diagnosis means I'm going to die sooner, and I don't want to die sooner, my wishes have no effect on the actual cancer cells. If you eat nothing but chocolate, you will gain weight. But if you don't want to get fat, that desire doesn't somehow make the chocolate have no calories. First, we need to look and see if evolution is true, and then only afterward consider what the theological consequences might be and adjust from there. From here, there's still 22 minutes of movie left, but none of it is scientific claims, unless you count the scenes of Adam petting a dinosaur. This last act of the film is dedicated to presenting the gospel message, bringing in evangelist Ray Comfort to try to seal the deal. Perhaps as an homage to Ray, the next scene of the Garden of Eden includes modern bananas, Ray's signature blunder from decades past, where he failed to realize that modern bananas have never existed in nature, but were instead selectively bred from other fruits with large, hard seeds. Assuming there was a Garden of Eden, modern bananas would not have been there, just as the relatively recent creation of modern house cats or dogs would not have been there, something most creation ministries acknowledge. As the film is done with science, so too shall we be done with the film. Though it does invoke this promise of more someday, with an angelic light descending to a tree. Presumably the tree of life, making this heavenly glow a fallen Satan or something? Much more than any individual detail we've discussed here on the Science of Genesis Paradise Lost, my desire is that the series will have demonstrated that you should always be skeptical of any claim, even mine. Over and over again, the movie used imprecise language, ignored key elements, and even misrepresented facts the speakers and editors should have known with only cursory investigation, all to sell a narrative they had decided on in advance, and went cherry-picking for any kind of support. Authority isn't a way to find truth, and scientific breakthroughs aren't distributed by 3D theatrical experiences.
We hope you've enjoyed the Science of Genesis Paradise Lost. Fancy graphics and a cool-sounding narrator don't automatically make claims accurate. As always, please check everything for yourself. If you'd like to support the work of Paulogia, please consider becoming a patron at the link in the description. Thanks for watching.